At 48, Margaret Hale discovered the man she'd crossed a continent to marry had never existed. The letters, dozens of them, promising land, partnership, a second chance at life, were lies written by a stranger. Now she stands in a Montana Territory town with $17, a carpetbag, and nowhere left to run. The stagecoach that brought her here won't return for 3 weeks. Her late husband's creditors still hunt her back east, and the sheriff is already asking questions she can't answer. Sometimes the end of one life is just the brutal beginning of another. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. Now, let's step into 1883 Montana Territory, where one woman's fight for survival became something far more dangerous, a fight for dignity. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Margaret Hale's head cracked against the wooden frame hard enough to make her vision blur. She didn't cry out. That reflex had died somewhere between Philadelphia and the Nebraska plains, buried under 2,000 miles of dust and the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. Across from her, a cattle buyer named Perkins slept with his mouth open, snoring through a nose that had been broken more than once. Beside him, a young woman in a traveling dress far too fine for this country clutched a baby and stared out the window with the hollow eyes of someone who'd already learned that Montana Territory didn't care about Eastern expectations. Margaret understood that look. She'd worn it herself 3 months ago, standing in her Philadelphia parlor while strangers inventoried her furniture and a lawyer explained, in the patient tone men used with women they assumed were stupid, that her late husband's business debts now belonged to her. Everything? She'd asked. Everything, Mrs. Hale. The house. The furniture. The small inheritance from her mother that Thomas had promised to keep separate, to keep safe, but had somehow folded into his failing textile venture like a gambler throwing good money after bad. She was 48 years old. Her only daughter had died of fever at age 12. Her son had moved to California 5 years ago and wrote twice a year, dutiful letters that said nothing and asked for less. Thomas had left her with debts, shame, and the kind of exhaustion that came from decades of pretending everything was fine while watching her husband drink his way through their future. And then, in the hollowed-out space where her life used to be, the letters had arrived. The first one had been waiting at the boarding house where she'd taken a room after the creditors seized her home. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside, careful handwriting on good paper. Dear Margaret, you don't know me, but I knew your late husband in passing years ago. I've heard of your circumstances and I'm compelled to write. I own a ranch in Montana Territory. Decent land, good water. I'm getting older and the work is too much for one man. I need someone with intelligence and grit to help run it. In return, I can offer partnership, security, and a fresh start far from Philadelphia's gossips. If you're interested, write back. If not, I understand. Respectfully, James Dalton. She'd thrown it away. Obviously a confidence scheme. She wasn't a fool, but the next week another letter came. Then another. Each one slightly more detailed. Descriptions of the ranch, the town, the territory. Nothing flowery or over-promising. Just practical information written by someone who seemed to understand that she needed facts, not flattery. The fourth letter had included a banker's draft for $25. For travel expenses, the note said. Consider it good faith. If you choose not to come, keep it. I suspect Philadelphia has taken enough from you already. That was the letter that broke her. Not because of the money, though God knew she needed it, but because of that single line. I suspect Philadelphia has taken enough from you already. Someone, somewhere, had seen her. Not as a debt to be collected or a scandal to be whispered about, but as a person who'd been ground down by circumstances and deserved better. She'd written back that night. 3 weeks later, she was stepping onto a westbound train with a carpetbag, her mother's wedding ring, and the kind of desperate hope that made smart women do stupid things. Now the stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Perkins jerked awake with a snort. Caldera, the driver called from above. 15-minute rest, then on to Fort Ellis. Margaret climbed out, her legs stiff from days of travel, her dress caked with a fine layer of dust that no amount of brushing would remove. The town spread before her like a wound that hadn't healed right. Wooden buildings thrown up fast and maintained poorly, dirt streets churned to mud by recent rain, and the sharp smell of horse manure mixed with wood smoke. Behind her, the young woman with the baby emerged, and Margaret instinctively steadied her elbow as she stepped down. "Thank you," the woman murmured. Up close, she was younger than Margaret had thought, maybe 22. "Is someone meeting you here?" "I'm continuing to Fort Ellis," Margaret said. "You?" "My husband works at one of the lumber camps north of here." She glanced down the street, her face tight with something that might have been fear or might have been regret. Hard to tell the difference anymore. "He sent for us 6 months ago. I kept delaying, thinking it would get easier to leave." Margaret understood that too. The weight of leaving, of admitting that the life you'd built was over and the next one might be worse. "Good luck," she said, and meant it. The woman nodded and walked toward a rough-looking man in work clothes who'd emerged from the general store. He didn't greet her with a kiss or a smile, just took her bag and jerked his chin toward a wagon. The woman followed, the baby silent against her shoulder. Margaret watched them go, then turned toward the building marked Post Office/Telegraph. If James Dalton had sent any additional instructions, they'd be waiting here. Inside, a rail-thin man with spectacles sat behind a counter covered in papers and parcels. He glanced up, assessed her in one quick look, middle-aged, travel-worn, Eastern clothes, and went back to his ledger. "Help you?" "I'm expecting correspondence," Margaret said. "Mrs. Margaret Hale, from Fort Ellis or the surrounding area." He didn't move. "Fort Ellis is 40 miles north. Mail comes through here twice a week, but we don't hold it. Gets sorted and goes on to the fort or back east, depending. I was told letters would be held here for me." "Told by who?" "James Dalton. He owns a ranch." The man's head snapped up. For a moment, something passed across his face. Surprise, maybe, or confusion, before his expression went carefully neutral. "James Dalton," he repeated. "Yes, I've been corresponding with him for 2 months. He asked me to stop here on my way to Fort Ellis and check for—" "Lady," the clerk said, not unkindly, "there's no James Dalton around here. Not at Fort Ellis, not in Caldera, not anywhere I've heard of in the past 15 years. The words hit her like a physical blow. "That's not possible. I have letters. I'm sure you do. But they didn't come from anyone local." Her throat closed. The small room suddenly felt airless, the walls too close. "You're certain? About a name like that?" "Yeah, I sort every piece of mail that comes through this office." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with something that might have been pity. "What exactly did these letters promise you?" Margaret's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt, willing them to stop. "A partnership on a ranch." In exchange for what?" The question was pointed and she felt the heat rise in her face. "Nothing. I mean, he sent money for travel. He said he needed someone with management experience to help run the property. It was a business arrangement." The clerk sighed, a long exhale that said he'd seen this before. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there's no ranch, no James Dalton, and no partnership. Someone ran a confidence scheme on you. Probably figured you'd get out here, realize you'd been duped, but be too embarrassed or too broke to go back home." No, that wasn't possible. The letters had been so detailed. The banker's draft had been real money, and James Dalton's words, the respect in them, the acknowledgement of her intelligence, that couldn't have been fake. Could it? "The letters mentioned specific locations," she said, hearing the desperate edge in her own voice. "A ranch 10 miles northwest of Fort Ellis, near a creek." He described the house, the outbuildings. "There's probably a dozen abandoned homesteads in that area," the clerk said. "Folks come out here with big dreams. The territory chews them up, and they leave. Scammers know that. They use real places because it sounds more convincing." He stood, came around the counter. "Look, you seem like a decent woman. How much did this cost you?" Everything. It had cost her everything. "I need to see it," Margaret said. "The location he described. If there's even a possibility, it's 40 miles through rough country. You'd need to hire a wagon or buy a horse, and that's assuming you know how to handle either one, plus supplies, plus—" He broke off, shaking his head. "It's not safe for a woman alone." "I'll hire someone to take me." "With what money? Even if you find someone willing, it'll cost you $10 minimum, probably more. And when you get out there and find nothing but a burned-out shack, if you even find that, you'll be stranded." The stagecoach driver's voice called from outside. "Loading up! Fort Ellis passengers, let's move. Margaret didn't move. The driver called again, impatient now. Through the window, she could see Perkins climbing back into the coach, the young mother and her baby already gone. In a moment, the stage would leave. She could get back on, continue to Fort Ellis, send a telegraph to someone back east. Though who, exactly, she couldn't say. Her son in California? He'd send money maybe, but with it would come questions and judgment and the kind of stiff disappointment that felt worse than anger. Or she could do what the clerk expected, admit defeat, use her last few dollars for passage back east, return to Philadelphia with her tail between her legs and face whatever waited there. Last call, the driver shouted. Margaret turned and walked out of the post office. But she didn't walk toward the stagecoach. She walked past it, into the street, toward the general store with its faded sign and mud-caked windows. Behind her, she heard the clerk call out, "Ma'am, where are you going?" But she didn't stop. The driver swore, said something about schedules and difficult women. A moment later, the stagecoach rolled away in a clatter of wheels and jangling harness, heading north toward Fort Ellis and leaving her behind. Margaret pushed open the door of the general store. Inside, the air smelled like leather and dried beans and something vaguely medicinal. Shelves lined the walls, tools, fabric, canned goods, ammunition. A pot-bellied stove sat cold in the center of the room, its pipe disappearing through the ceiling. Behind the counter, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime in hard country looked up from a ledger. "Help you?" "I need to hire someone to take me northwest of Fort Ellis," Margaret said, "to a specific location, 10 miles out, near a creek." The woman's expression didn't change. "That's 40 miles through open country. You got people waiting for you out there?" "No." "Then why are you going?" "That's my business." The woman studied her for a long moment, then set down her pencil. "Fair enough, but nobody's going to take you for less than $15. And that's if you find someone foolish enough to try. Most folks with wagons are hauling freight or working claims. They don't have time to ferry lost Eastern ladies around the territory." "I'm not lost." "You look lost to me." Margaret's jaw tightened. She was tired, so deeply tired, and this woman's bluntness felt like one more weight added to a load she could barely carry. But breaking down here, in front of a stranger, wouldn't help anything. "I have $13, she said, "and I can work. If someone needs help loading goods, or $13 won't get you a horse, let alone a wagon and driver." The woman came around the counter, moving with the careful gait of someone whose joints didn't bend the way they used to. "What's really going on here?" "I told you, I need to reach a location northwest of—" "I heard what you said. I'm asking what you're not saying." The woman crossed her arms. "You wouldn't be the first person to come out here chasing something that doesn't exist. Montana Territory eats people like you for breakfast. So before you spend your last dime on a wild goose chase, maybe you should sit down and think this through." Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not concerned. I'm practical. And practically speaking, you look like you haven't slept in a week. You're wearing a dress that's falling apart, and you've got the kind of desperation rolling off you that makes bad situations worse." The woman moved to the stove, began building a fire. "Sit. I'll make coffee. Then you can tell me why you're really here." For a moment, Margaret considered walking out. But the stagecoach was gone, her options were vanishing fast, and this blunt, unsympathetic woman was the closest thing to help she'd found since arriving in Montana Territory. She sat. The woman worked in silence, building the fire with practiced efficiency, setting a battered coffee pot on top to heat. When it was done, she poured 2 tin cups and handed one to Margaret. "Name's Ruth Palmer. I run this place with my son, though he's up at Fort Benton right now sorting out a freight mess." She sat on a barrel across from Margaret, cupping her coffee with both hands. "Now talk." So Margaret talked. She told Ruth about Thomas's death, the debts, the letters from James Dalton. She told her about the banker's draft and the detailed descriptions of the ranch. She told her about the post clerk's claim that no such person existed, and the growing certainty that she'd been swindled by someone clever enough to exploit her desperation. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she took a long drink of coffee, then said, "You're probably right. Someone likely ran a con on you." Margaret's chest tightened. Hearing it said so plainly hurt worse than she'd expected. But, Ruth continued, that doesn't mean there's nothing out there. Margaret looked up. What do you mean? There's an old homestead about where you're describing. Belonged to a family named Brennan. Husband, wife, 3 kids. Built a decent-sized operation, worked it for maybe 8 years. Then 2 winters ago, a fire took the house and barn. Husband and the oldest boy died. Wife and the 2 younger kids packed up and went back to Ohio. Ruth refilled her cup. Property's been sitting empty since. No one's claimed it, no one's working it, just land going back to wild. Margaret's pulse quickened. Could someone be living there now, squatting, maybe, or… Doubt it, too exposed. Anyone with sense would have moved closer to Fort Ellis or Caldera before winter hit. Ruth paused. But there's a man who'd know. Ethan Crow. He's got a forge about 6 miles northwest of here. Does metalwork, fixes tools, shoes horses when folks can pay. He knew the Brennans, helped them build some of their equipment. Where can I find him? His place is off the main trail. You'd need someone to show you. Ruth stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the empty street. Tell you what, my son's due back in 3 days. He'll be heading past Crow's place on his way to Fort Ellis. You can ride along, talk to Crow, see if he knows anything about your Mr. Dalton or that property. 3 days, Margaret repeated. 3 days in this town, with her money dwindling and no guarantees that this Crow person would have answers. That, or you can try your luck hiring someone today for triple what you've got. Ruth turned back to her. Your choice. Margaret stared into her coffee. The rational part of her brain, the part that had managed Thomas's failing business for years, that had stretched pennies into survival and kept their household running while he drank himself into an early grave, told her to cut her losses. Except that she'd been conned. Use what little money she had left to get somewhere stable, maybe work as a housekeeper or seamstress until she saved enough for passage back east. But that same rational voice had been telling her for years that staying with Thomas was the smart choice, the respectable choice. That enduring was what good women did. And where had that gotten her? I'll wait, Margaret said. Ruth nodded, unsurprised. You can sleep in the storeroom. I've got a cot back there. It's not much, but it's dry and the roof doesn't leak. In exchange, you can help around the store, sweeping, organizing stock, whatever I need. Fair? It was more than fair. It was mercy disguised as practicality. Thank you, Margaret said. Don't thank me yet. You might still end up wishing you'd gotten back on that stagecoach. The storeroom was exactly what Ruth had promised. Not much. A narrow cot with a thin mattress, a crate for a table, and a single lantern that gave off more smoke than light. But it had a door that closed and a blanket that, while scratchy, kept out the worst of the night cold. Margaret lay awake that first night, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar town, horses moving past, men's voices raised in argument or laughter, the distant plinking of a poorly tuned piano from what she assumed was a saloon. In Philadelphia, the nights had been different, quieter, more ordered. Even in the worst days after Thomas's death, there had been the comfort of familiar sounds, familiar streets. Here, everything felt raw and uncertain. She thought about the letters, about James Dalton's careful handwriting, his measured words. She'd read them so many times that she had whole passages memorized. The territory is hard country, Margaret, but it's honest in its way. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. Had he, or whoever had written those letters, known how perfectly that line would hook her? How desperately she'd needed to believe that somewhere, somehow, there existed a place that didn't deal in polite lies and careful pretense? In the darkness, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the humiliation, the betrayal, the bone-deep exhaustion of being 48 years old and starting over with nothing. Then she closed her eyes and forced it down. There would be time for grief later. Right now, she needed to survive the next 3 days. The work Ruth gave her wasn't difficult, but it was constant. Margaret swept floors, organized shelves, helped unload a freight wagon that arrived on the second day. She counted inventory, memorized prices, learned which customers paid in cash and which kept accounts they settled monthly, or didn't settle at all. Ruth was a hard woman to read. She didn't chat or offer unnecessary kindness, but she also didn't condescend. When Margaret asked questions about the territory, what crops grew, how the winters ran, who held power in places like Caldera, Ruth answered with the same blunt practicality she'd shown that first day. Town's run by whoever's got the most money and the fewest scruples, she said on the second afternoon. They were unpacking canned goods, checking for dents and rust. Right now, that's Claude Hayward. Owns the hotel, the saloon, and half the buildings on this street. He came out here during the gold rush, didn't find much, but figured out there's more money in supplying miners than being one. Is he honest? Ruth snorted. He's a businessman. Out here, that's the same as saying he'll rob you, but smile while doing it. She held up a can with a suspicious bulge. This one's bad. Set it aside. Margaret added it to the discard pile. What about law? Is there a sheriff? Territorial marshal comes through every few months. Caldera's too small for a dedicated lawman. Most disputes get settled personal-like, if you catch my meaning. Margaret caught her meaning. Violence as justice, reputation as currency. She'd known intellectually that the territory operated differently than eastern cities, but hearing it stated so plainly was unsettling. On the third day, Ruth's son arrived. Daniel Palmer was in his early 30s, built like a man who'd spent his life doing hard physical work. He had his mother's gray eyes and the same blunt, assessing manner. When Ruth introduced Margaret and explained the situation, he listened without comment, then said, "Crow's place is on the way. We can stop. But I'm not waiting around if he's not there or if this turns into something complicated." "Understood," Margaret said. They left before dawn. The wagon was loaded with supplies for Fort Ellis, and Margaret sat on the bench beside Daniel as the town fell away behind them and the landscape opened up into rolling grassland broken by rocky outcrops and distant mountains. The silence between them was comfortable enough. Daniel didn't seem inclined to talk, and Margaret was too focused on the country around her to make conversation. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, so different from Pennsylvania's tamed fields and manicured towns. Here, the land felt alive and indifferent, like it would swallow you whole if you stopped paying attention. After 2 hours, Daniel pointed to a thin column of smoke rising from a shallow valley. "That's Crow's Forge." Margaret's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment when she'd find out if there was any truth to James Dalton's letters, or if she'd been chasing shadows across 2,000 miles. The forge sat at the base of a hillside, a low stone building with a patched roof and a chimney belching gray smoke. Beside it stood a smaller structure, living quarters, Margaret assumed, and a rough corral holding 2 horses. Tools and metal scraps littered the ground, and the air smelled like coal smoke and hot iron. A man emerged from the forge as they approached. Tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his early 50s. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned at the shoulder. His face was scarred, deep burns that twisted the skin along his jaw and down his neck. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to do everything one-handed. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop. "Crow." "Palmer." The man's voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. His eyes flicked to Margaret, registered her presence, then dismissed her. "Need something?" "Lady here's looking for information. Says she's been corresponding with someone named James Dalton, claims he owns property northwest of Fort Ellis." Ethan Crow went very still. When he spoke again, his voice had a dangerous edge. "Who sent you?" Margaret climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the ride. "No one sent me. I received letters over several months describing a ranch partnership. The writer identified himself as James Dalton and asked me to come out here." "And you believed it?" It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Margaret lifted her chin. "I had reason to." "Lady, there's no James Dalton, never has been." Crow turned back toward the forge. "You got conned. Go home." "Wait." Margaret moved to block his path, though standing this close to him made her aware of just how large and intimidating he was. The letters described specific property. Ruth Palmer said there was an old homestead, the Brennan's place. Is it still there? Crow's jaw tightened. What's left of it? Could someone be living there now? No. How do you know? Because I go by there every few months to make sure squatters haven't moved in. He stepped around her. It's a burned ruin. Nothing worth salvaging. Margaret's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to keep talking. If someone were trying to scam me using that property, would they know about it? Is it common knowledge? Crow stopped, turned, studied her with those hard, unreadable eyes. What exactly are you asking? I'm asking if it's possible that the person who wrote those letters actually knew the property. If they might have information about it that others wouldn't. Well, why would that matter? Because if there was even a grain of truth in those letters, if the person who wrote them had actually seen the place, actually understood what it was, then maybe, just maybe, there was something salvageable. But she couldn't say that, couldn't admit how desperately she needed there to be something real waiting at the end of this disaster. It matters, she said quietly. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. You don't want to go out there. It's 40 miles of rough trail, and there's nothing to find except disappointment. I'll decide that for myself. You'll get lost. Or worse. Then show me the way. Daniel shifted on the wagon seat. Lady, I've got a schedule. I can't. I'm not asking you, Margaret said, not taking her eyes off Crow. I'm asking him. Crow laughed, a short, bitter sound. I don't guide lost Eastern women on fool's errands. I'll pay you. With what? You don't look like you've got $2 to rub together. He was right, but Margaret had learned long ago that when money ran out, you offered what you had left. I can work. Ruth said you do metal work. I'm guessing that includes some bookkeeping, some organization. I managed my late husband's business for 20 years. I know accounts, inventory, customer relations. You take me to that property, and I'll work for you. 1 week of labor. I don't need help. Everyone needs help. You're just too stubborn to admit it. Daniel made a sound that might have been a laugh. Crow shot him a look, then turned back to Margaret. 1 week of work isn't worth 2 days of travel. 2 weeks, then. Lady, 1 month. She heard herself say it, heard the desperation bleeding through, and hated it, but she kept her voice steady. 1 month of work, whatever you need, in exchange for taking me to the Brennan property and back. That's fair. Crow stared at her. Then he looked at Daniel. She always this stubborn? Just met her 3 days ago, Daniel said. But yeah, seems like it. For a long moment, no one spoke. A hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal current. The forge fire hissed and crackled. Margaret felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. The knowledge that if Crow said no, she had no backup plan, no safety net, nothing but a one-way ticket back to a life that had already proven it didn't want her. Finally, Crow exhaled. We leave tomorrow at dawn. Bring whatever supplies you've got. The trail's rough, and there's no shelter. If you slow me down, I'm leaving you behind. Understood? Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her lightheaded. Understood. And when we get there and you see it's nothing but ashes and broken timber, you don't get to complain. You wanted to see it. Fine. But don't waste my time crying about what you find. I won't. Crow looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once and walked back into the forge without another word. Margaret climbed back onto the wagon beside Daniel. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was adrenaline, determination, and the first spark of something that felt dangerously like hope. You're either very brave or very stupid, Daniel said as he snapped the reins and the wagon rolled forward. Probably both, Margaret said. Behind them, the forge smoke rose into the clear Montana sky. And ahead, the mountains waited like a promise that hadn't decided yet whether to keep itself. That night, back in Ruth's storeroom, Margaret went through her carpet bag. She had 2 changes of clothes, both worn thin from travel, a hairbrush with 3 broken teeth, a small sewing kit, her mother's wedding ring wrapped in a handkerchief, and at the bottom, carefully folded, the letters from James Dalton. She unfolded the first one, reading it again by lamplight. You don't know me, but I knew your late husband in passing years ago. Lies. All of it, probably, but the writing was real. The paper was real. Someone had taken the time to craft these letters, to research her situation, to build an elaborate fiction designed specifically to hook her. Why? That was the question that had been gnawing at her since the post clerk shattered her illusions. Con artists wanted money, but the person who'd written these letters had sent her money. They'd told her to keep it even if she didn't come. Nothing about that made sense. Unless the goal wasn't to steal from her. Unless the goal was to get her here. But why? What could anyone possibly want from a broke, middle-aged widow with no connections and no prospects? Margaret folded the letters and tucked them back into her bag. Tomorrow, maybe she'd have answers. Or maybe she'd just have more questions and 40 fewer miles between her and whatever truth waited at the Brennan property. Either way, she thought as she blew out the lamp and lay down on the narrow cot, she'd made her choice. For better or worse, she was moving forward instead of back. And that, at least, was something. Dawn came cold and gray. Margaret dressed in her sturdiest clothes, which wasn't saying much, and met Ruth in the store's main room. "Coffee's on the stove," Ruth said. She was packing food into a canvas sack, hardtack, dried meat, a small sack of cornmeal. "This should get you through a few days. There's a canteen by the door." "How much do I owe you?" "Call it payment for the work you did. And before you argue, don't. I don't give charity, so this isn't that. You worked, I'm compensating you. Simple." Margaret took the offered sack. "Thank you, Ruth." "Don't thank me. Just don't die out there. I'd hate to think I wasted good supplies." But there was something in the older woman's eyes that might have been concern, or respect, or both. Ethan Crow arrived just after sunrise, leading a saddled horse and a pack mule loaded with gear. He looked at Margaret's carpet bag and said, "That everything?" "Yes." "Good. Means we can move fast." He tied her bag to the mule, then gestured to the horse. "You ride?" "Not in years. You're about to relearn. Come on." He helped her mount, his single hand surprisingly strong and steady, then swung up behind her. The horse shifted under their combined weight, but settled quickly. "Hold on," Crow said. His voice was close to her ear, matter of fact. "And if you fall off, I'm not stopping." They rode out of Caldera as the town woke around them, heading northwest into country that grew rougher and more remote with every mile. And Margaret, who had left Philadelphia with such careful hope, who had crossed a continent chasing letters written by a man who didn't exist, felt the first whisper of something she hadn't experienced in years: the wild, dangerous thrill of having absolutely nothing left to lose. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Margaret gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her body rigid as she tried to anticipate the horse's movements. Behind her, Ethan Crow rode with the loose confidence of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. "Relax," he said finally. "You're fighting the animal. Move with it, not against it." Easy for him to say. Margaret's thighs already ached, and her lower back felt like someone had driven a spike through it, but she forced herself to loosen her grip, to let her body find the rhythm instead of resisting it. It helped. Slightly. The trail, such as it was, wound through grassland dotted with sage and wild grasses that bent in the wind like water. To the north, the mountains rose in jagged peaks still capped with snow despite the advancing spring. The sky stretched endlessly above them, so vast and empty it made Margaret feel small in a way Philadelphia's crowded streets never had. "How far to the Brennan place?" she asked. 35 miles, give or take. We'll make camp tonight, reach it by mid-morning tomorrow." A whole night out here, under that enormous sky. Margaret pushed down the flutter of anxiety in her chest. She'd slept in worse places. The storeroom in Caldera, for instance. The boarding house after Thomas died, where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument and transaction in the rooms around her. "You said you knew the Brennans," she said. "What were they like?" Crow was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, hard-working, stubborn. John Brennan was the kind of man who thought will and sweat could overcome anything. He was wrong. The fire. Was it an accident? Does it matter? I suppose not. Margaret shifted in the saddle, trying to ease the pressure on her spine. "Ruth said you helped them build equipment. What kind?" "Plows, harrows, a water pump for the well." His voice was flat, giving nothing away. "Standard homestead work. And you do that for everyone in the area?" "For people who can pay or trade. Why?" "Just curious, trying to understand how things work out here." "Things work simple. You provide something people need. They give you something in return. Money, goods, labor. No one survives alone, but no one trusts easy either. Territories full of people running from something or chasing something they'll never catch." Margaret heard the edge in those words. "Which one are you?" "Neither. I'm just here." It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth, but Margaret didn't push. They all had their secrets. She certainly had hers. The sun climbed higher, turning the day warm enough that Margaret shed her shawl and tied it around her waist. Sweat dampened her collar. Her water canteen, which had seemed plenty full that morning, was already half empty. Around noon, Crow guided them off the trail toward a rocky outcrop where a thin stream cut through the grass. He dismounted with easy grace, then reached up to help Margaret down. Her legs buckled when her feet hit the ground, and she would have fallen if he hadn't caught her arm. "First day's always the worst," he said, releasing her once she'd steadied. "Walk it off while I water the animals." Margaret hobbled in small circles, her muscles screaming protest. Everything hurt, her back, her thighs, her rear, even her hands from gripping so tightly. She felt like she'd aged another decade in the span of a few hours. Crow filled the canteens from the stream, then pulled out a cloth bundle containing dried meat and hardtack. He offered half to Margaret without ceremony. They ate standing up. The meat was tough and heavily salted, the hardtack nearly impossible to chew. Margaret forced it down anyway, washing it with water that tasted faintly of minerals. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. "Montana, 12 years. Where were you before?" "East." He didn't elaborate. Margaret tried a different approach. "Ruth mentioned you lost your arm. If you don't mind my asking." "I do mind." The words were flat and final. Margaret nodded and dropped it, though she'd already noticed the way he compensated for the missing limb. The careful balance, the strategic positioning of his body, the rope systems he'd rigged on the pack mule to make loading and unloading easier with one hand. "Why a Ford?" she asked instead. "Why not ranching or mining or—" "Because I know metalwork. Learned it from my father, worked it for 20 years before I came west. It's steady income, and I don't have to depend on weather or luck." He rewrapped the food, tucked it back into his saddlebag. "And because I can do it alone." There it was again, that deliberate isolation, the walls built high and reinforced. Margaret recognized it because she'd built her own walls over the years, brick by brick, disappointment by disappointment. "We should move," Crow said. "Want to cover another 15 miles before dark." They rode on. The landscape changed gradually, the grassland giving way to rolling hills broken by ravines and dry creek beds. Stands of pine appeared, dark green against the golden grass. Once, Margaret saw a small herd of antelope in the distance, watching them with alert stillness before bounding away. The silence between them settled into something almost comfortable. Crow wasn't chatty, but he wasn't hostile either. He pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a stand of cottonwoods that marked water, with the economy of someone who wasted neither words nor effort. As the sun dipped toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Crow guided them into a shallow ravine sheltered by a rock overhang. "We'll camp here," he said, dismounting. "There's a spring just past those rocks. You can wash up while I set up." Margaret slid off the horse, more controlled this time, and followed his directions. The spring was barely more than a trickle, but the water was cold and clear. She knelt beside it, splashing her face and neck, washing away the dust and sweat of the day. When she returned, Crow had already unsaddled the animals and hobbled them where they could graze. He'd built a small fire and was setting up a lean-to using canvas and rope. "I can help," Margaret offered. "Done." He straightened, studied the setup with a critical eye, then nodded once. "You sleep there. I'll take first watch." "Watch for what?" "Bears, mountain lions, men looking for easy targets." He pulled out a rifle from the pack, checked it with practiced efficiency. "Probably nothing, but probably's gotten people killed out here." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. She'd been so focused on reaching the Brennan property that she hadn't fully considered the dangers of simply getting there. Crow must have seen something in her face because his expression softened, barely, but enough to notice. "Fire keeps most animals away, and I'm a light sleeper. You'll be fine." He heated water for coffee, mixed cornmeal with water and salt to make a thick paste that he fried in a pan over the fire. It wasn't good exactly, but it was hot and filling, and Margaret ate every bite. As darkness settled over the ravine, the temperature dropped fast. Margaret wrapped herself in a blanket from the pack and sat near the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds. Wind through the grass, the distant yip of coyotes, the soft movement of the hobbled animals. Crow sat across from her, rifle across his knees, his scarred face half in shadow. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said, "Can I ask you something?" "Depends on the question." "Why did you agree to bring me out here? You clearly didn't want to." Crow was silent for a moment, his gaze on the fire. "You reminded me of someone." "Who?" "Mary Brennan, John's wife." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. "She came out here same as you, chasing a promise from a man who made everything sound better than it was. Difference was, her man actually existed. Just turned out he was better at dreaming than doing." Margaret waited. After a moment, Crow continued. "She worked harder than he did, honestly. Kept the household running, managed the garden, helped with the livestock, even learned to handle the plow when John was laid up with a broken leg one season. She didn't complain, didn't give up, just kept going." He paused. "When the fire happened, she tried to go back in for the kids. We had to physically hold her back. She fought us like a wild thing." "That's terrible." "Yeah." Crow's voice was rough. "She buried her husband and son, packed up what was left, and took the surviving kids back to Ohio. Last I heard, she was working in a factory making shirts for 60 cents a day." He looked up at Margaret. "So when you stood there in my forge, desperate and stubborn and clearly in over your head, I thought, hell, maybe this one gets a chance to see the truth before it costs her everything." Margaret absorbed that. "You think I'll leave once I see the property?" "I think you should." "What if I don't?" "Then you're a fool, but that's your choice to make." He stood, walked to the edge of the firelight, and stared out into the darkness. "Get some sleep. We leave at first light." Margaret lay down under the lean-to, the ground hard beneath her blanket. She was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept circling back to Crow's story, to Mary Brennan, who'd done everything right and still lost everything. To the randomness of fire and fate, the way the territory seemed to chew people up without malice or mercy, just indifferent appetite. Finally, exhaustion won. She drifted into uneasy sleep, dreaming of burning houses and letters written in ash. She woke once in the deep hours before dawn to find Crow still awake, still watching, the rifle steady in his hand. Something about that vigilance, that quiet, steadfast attention to keeping them safe, made her throat tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Then she closed her eyes and slept again, and when she woke at dawn, the fire was burning fresh and coffee was already brewing. They ate quickly, more of the cornmeal mush, more of the leather-tough dried meat, and broke camp with efficient speed. Margaret's body protested every movement, her muscles stiff and aching, but she forced herself to mount the horse without complaint. The morning air was crisp and cold, their breath visible in pale clouds. Crow set a steady pace northwest, following trails that Margaret couldn't always see, reading the land with the ease of long practice. "Another hour," he said, as the sun climbed higher. "Maybe less." Margaret's pulse quickened. 1 hour. After everything, the letters, the journey, the doubts and desperate hopes, she was 1 hour away from finding out if there was anything real waiting for her, or if she'd crossed a continent for nothing. The landscape began to change. They followed a creek that ran faster here, cutting through rocky banks lined with willows. The grass was greener, the soil darker. Good land, Margaret thought, the kind that could support crops, livestock. Then Crow pulled his horse to a stop at the top of a small rise. "There," he said quietly. Margaret looked. Below them, in a shallow valley carved by the creek, sat the ruins of the Brennan homestead. The house was gone. Just a blackened stone foundation and scattered timbers, some still standing like broken teeth. The barn had fared slightly better. One wall remained, along with part of the roof structure, though everything was charred and weathered. A collapsed chicken coop, a water trough, cracked and dry. The skeletal remains of a wagon wheel. But it wasn't empty. Someone had been here. Recently. Crow saw it the same moment Margaret did. His body went tense, his hand moving automatically toward the rifle. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and sharp. Like hell. Margaret was already sliding off the horse, her stiffness forgotten. Margaret. She ignored him, walking down the slope toward the ruins. Behind her, she heard Crow swear and follow. The evidence was clear once you looked. Someone had cleared part of the debris from the house foundation. Someone had stacked usable timber in neat piles. Someone had repaired part of the barn wall with fresh lumber, rough work, but functional. And near the creek, someone had built a small fire ring, the stones still blackened with recent ash. Margaret walked through it all, her mind racing. This wasn't abandonment. This was preparation. Squatters, Crow said, scanning the area with hard eyes. Probably moved on when winter hit, but they've been working the place. Or someone's planning to rebuild. Margaret moved to the barn, running her hand along the new lumber. This work is recent, within the last few weeks. So why would squatters invest time and effort repairing a place they don't own? Crow didn't answer. He was examining the ground near the fire ring, frowning at something. Margaret walked to the house foundation, stepping carefully over the charred timbers. The stone hearth still stood, blackened but intact. She could picture it, the fire that would have burned there, the family gathered around it on cold nights, Mary Brennan making dinner, the children doing lessons by firelight, all of it gone. But someone thought it could be rebuilt. Someone had looked at this ruin and seen possibility. Margaret, Crow's voice was tight. Come here. She turned. He was holding something, a piece of paper, folded and tucked into the stones of the fire ring. Her heart stopped. Crow unfolded it carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at her, and something in his eyes made her cold. What is it? She asked. He handed it to her without a word. The handwriting was instantly familiar, the same careful script from the letters she'd carried across the country. Margaret, if you're reading this, you made it. I wasn't sure you would. Most people would have turned back in Caldera, and I wouldn't have blamed you. I'm sorry for the deception. There was no other way to get you here, and you needed to come. Not for me, for yourself. The property is yours if you want it. I filed preliminary claim papers in Fort Ellis under your name. They're waiting at the land office. The work you see here, the repairs, the clearing, I did that. Preparation for what comes next if you choose to stay. I can't meet you face to face. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I can give you this. A chance to build something real, something yours. In a place that doesn't care about your past or your age or your mistakes. The territory is hard, but you're harder. I saw that in you before you saw it in yourself. Everything you need is here. The choice is yours. J.D. Margaret read it twice, her hands shaking. Then she looked up at Crow, who was watching her with an intensity that felt almost dangerous. What the hell is this? He said quietly. I don't know. That's not good enough. Someone's been watching you, manipulating you, setting up some kind of... He broke off, jaw tight. This is wrong, Margaret. All of it. You need to walk away right now. Walk away to what? The words came out sharper than she intended. I have $13 and no home. I can't go back to Philadelphia. There's nothing there for me. And I can't go forward without knowing what this is. So you're just going to trust some mysterious stranger who admits to deceiving you? No. I'm going to go to Fort Ellis, check if those land claim papers actually exist, and make a decision based on facts. She folded the letter, tucked it into her pocket. If they're real, if the property is genuinely being offered to me, then I'll consider it. If not, then I'll figure out what comes next. Crow stared at her. You're serious? Yes. You realize this could be another con. Could be 10 cons stacked on top of each other. I'm aware. And you still want to see it through. Margaret looked at the ruins around them, the burned timbers and broken stones, the fresh lumber and cleared ground. Someone had stood here and decided that destruction wasn't the end of the story. Someone had believed that what was broken could be rebuilt. Maybe they were a con artist. Maybe this was elaborate manipulation leading to some trap she couldn't yet see. Or maybe, just maybe, someone had looked at her from a distance and seen what she'd stopped seeing in herself. Potential. Yes, she said. I still want to see it through. Crow was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Fort Ellis is 10 miles north. We can make it by early afternoon. He moved toward the horses, then paused. But Margaret, when this goes sideways, and it will, don't say I didn't warn you. They mounted up and rode out, leaving the ruined homestead behind. But as the valley disappeared behind them, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't leaving it at all. She was coming home to it, in some strange way she didn't fully understand. The ride to Fort Ellis passed in tense silence. Crow's jaw was set, his body radiating disapproval, But he didn't try to talk her out of what she was doing. Margaret appreciated that, even as part of her wondered if he was right, if she was walking into disaster with her eyes wide open. Fort Ellis appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, then gradually took shape, a military outpost surrounded by a scatter of civilian buildings that had grown up around it like mushrooms after rain, larger than Caldera, more established, but still rough and unfinished in the way of territory towns. Crow led them directly to a long, low building with land office painted across the front in fading letters. "You sure about this?" he asked as they dismounted. "No," Margaret said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." The land office was dim inside, smelling of paper and tobacco smoke. A clerk in shirt sleeves and wire spectacles looked up from a desk covered in maps and documents. "Help you?" "I'm looking for land claim papers filed under the name Margaret Hale." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Hale. You said?" "Yes." He stood, moved to a filing cabinet, and began rifling through papers with practiced efficiency. After a moment, he pulled out a folder and opened it. Margaret Hale. Preliminary claim filed 3 weeks ago for 160 acres, Northwest Section 12, Township 4. Property formerly registered to John Brennan, deceased. Claim filed by proxy with authorization documentation. He looked up. "That you?" Margaret's mouth went dry. Yes, but I didn't file that claim." "Says here you did. Or rather, someone filed on your behalf with power of attorney documentation." He pulled out a paper, held it up. "That your signature?" She leaned closer. The signature at the bottom read Margaret R. Hale in handwriting that was definitely not hers, but close enough to pass casual inspection. "That's not—" she started, then stopped. Because saying it wasn't her signature meant admitting to fraud, and she had no idea what the legal implications of that were. Crow stepped forward. "Who filed the paperwork?" "Doesn't say. Filed by courier with notarized documentation. Everything's in order." The clerk studied Margaret. "Is there a problem?" "No," Margaret said quickly. "No problem. I wasn't sure the paperwork had gone through. It's preliminary approval. You've got 12 months to establish residence and make improvements. After that, you can file for final patent, pay the fees, and the land's yours." He tucked the papers back into the folder. "There's an outstanding balance of $32 in filing fees and taxes. You can pay that now or within the next 6 months. $32. Margaret had 13. "Can I come back?" she asked. "Sure, just don't wait too long. Territory doesn't like sitting on unpaid fees." The clerk returned to his desk, already moving on to the next task. Outside, in the harsh afternoon sunlight, Margaret stood very still. The land was real. The claim was real. Someone had put her name on legal documents and invested real money in making this happen. "This is insane," Crow said. "I know. You don't know who's behind this. You don't know what they want." "I know. And you're still considering it." Margaret turned to face him. "Ethan, I have $13, no home, and no prospects. Someone is offering me 160 acres of land that, yes, needs work, but is actually buildable. Even if it's a trap, even if there's a catch I can't see yet, what exactly am I giving up by trying?" "Your safety, your sanity, possibly your life." "I already gave up the first 2 in Philadelphia, and the third—" She broke off, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "The third wasn't worth much anyway." Crow's scarred face was unreadable. "That's a hell of a thing to say." "It's true." Margaret walked to the edge of the street, looked out at the mountains rising in the distance. "I spent 26 years married to a man who drank himself to death, while I held together his failing business and pretended everything was fine. I lost my daughter. My son barely speaks to me. And when Thomas finally died, I found out he'd managed to turn even that into one more disaster I had to clean up." She took a breath. "So yes, maybe this is a trap. Maybe I'm being manipulated by someone with goals I can't see, but at least it's something. At least I'm making a choice instead of just enduring what gets handed to me." For a long moment, Crow said nothing. Then, "The property needs at least $300 in materials just to be minimally livable. Lumber, nails, windows, a stove. That's not counting labor or tools or livestock or seed or any of the 1,000 other things you'd need to actually work the land. I know. And you'd be alone out there, miles from help. If something happened, injury, illness, fire, you could die before anyone found you. I know that too. Crow exhaled hard. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. So I've been told. He turned, walked a few steps away, then back. When he spoke again, his voice was different, less challenging, more resigned. You remember the deal we made? 1 month of work in exchange for bringing you here? Yes, I'll modify it. You work for me, handling accounts, organizing the forge, helping with jobs that need 2 hands. In exchange, I'll help you build. Basic shelter first, then we'll see what else is possible. Margaret stared at him. Why would you do that? Because Mary Brennan didn't get a choice. Her husband made decisions that killed him and damn near killed her kids, and she had to live with the consequences. He met her eyes. But you're getting a choice, even if it's a strange one, and I guess I'd rather help you make it work than stand by and watch you fail. Something in Margaret's chest loosened. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Say you'll be smart. Say you'll listen when I tell you something's dangerous. Say you won't do anything stupid just to prove you can. I'll try. That's not reassuring. It's the best I can offer. Crow almost smiled, the first time she'd seen anything close to it. Fair enough. He moved toward the horses. We should head back. I've got work piling up, and if we're doing this, we need to start soon. Winter comes early up here. They rode out of Fort Ellis as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Margaret's mind was spinning with calculations. Materials needed, costs, timelines. It was overwhelming. Impossible, really, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something other than exhaustion or grief or numb determination. She felt alive. The ride back to Crow's Forge took 3 days. 2 nights camping under stars so bright and numerous they seemed unreal, and days of steady travel through country that was beginning to feel, if not familiar, then at least less alien. Crow pointed out more landmarks, taught her to read weather in the clouds and distance in the lay of the land. He wasn't warm, exactly, but he was patient, and Margaret found herself grateful for his gruff competence. On the 3rd afternoon, they arrived back at the forge. Crow helped her down from the horse, then began unloading the pack mule with practiced efficiency. Storeroom's in the back, he said, nodding toward his small living quarters. You can sleep there. It's not much, but it's dry. What about you? I'll make do in the forge. Done it before. Ethan, I can't take your room. You're not. I'm giving it to you. There's a difference. He carried her carpet bag inside without waiting for further argument. The storeroom was small and cluttered with tools and materials, but it had a narrow bed and a window that let in light. Margaret set down her bag and looked around, feeling the strange reality of her situation settle over her. She was in Montana territory. She owned, or would own, 160 acres of land. She had a temporary home and work arrangement with a scarred, one-armed blacksmith who clearly valued solitude, but had somehow decided to help her anyway. It was absurd, terrifying, completely unlike anything she'd planned or expected. And somehow, standing in that cluttered storeroom with evening light falling through the dusty window, Margaret felt more at home than she had in years. Margaret woke to the sound of hammer striking anvil, a rhythm so steady it felt like the heartbeat of the place itself. Dawn light filtered through the small window, turning the dust motes gold. Her body ached. Different from the horse-riding pain, this was the deep soreness of muscles unused to physical labor starting to remember what work felt like. She dressed quickly in her oldest clothes and found Crow already at the forge. Stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the morning chill, sweat darkening the fabric across his back. He was shaping what looked like a hinge, his single hand working the tongs with such precision that she almost forgot he was missing the other one. There's coffee on the stove, he said without looking up. And bread in the tin if you're hungry. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, the bread dense and slightly stale, but Margaret ate gratefully. Through the open door of the forge, she watched Crow work, the way he read the color of heated metal, the economy of his movements, the absolute focus that shut out everything else. When he finally set the piece aside to cool, she asked, "What do you need me to do?" He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. Accounts first. I've got 3 months of receipts in a box that need sorting. Customers who've paid, customers who haven't, what materials I need to order. It's a mess. The box was indeed a mess. Scraps of paper covered in illegible handwriting, some water-damaged, others torn. Margaret spread them out on the workbench near the window and began the painstaking work of deciphering and organizing. It took most of the morning, but gradually a picture emerged. Crow had steady business, farmers needing tool repairs, ranchers needing horseshoes and gate hardware, even some orders from Fort Ellis for specialty items. But his record-keeping was chaotic, and she quickly identified at least $40 in unpaid debts from customers who'd apparently forgotten or hoped he'd forgotten. "You're letting people rob you," she said when she showed him the list. Crow glanced at it, shrugged. "Some folks are good for it eventually, others aren't. Not much I can do about it. You could refuse service until they settle their accounts. Then they go to the smith in Fort Ellis, and I lose the business entirely. So you just keep working for free? I keep working for the people who do pay. The others," he shrugged again. "Territory's hard. Sometimes folks need help they can't immediately afford." Margaret understood the impulse, but the business manager in her recoiled. "That's fine for charity, but this isn't a charity. This is your livelihood." She tapped one name on the list. "Claude Hayward. He owes you $18 for custom ironwork on his hotel. Ruth Palmer told me he's the richest man in Caldera. Why hasn't he paid?" "He will." "When?" "This invoice is from February. It's May now." Crow's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." "Let me handle it." "That's what you brought me here for, isn't it? To manage this side of things?" "Margaret, do you want the money or not?" He stared at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he sighed. "Fine. But don't make enemies of people who can make life difficult." "I won't make enemies. I'll just make them pay what they owe." 3 days later, Margaret rode into Caldera on one of Crow's horses, a leather satchel containing copies of unpaid invoices strapped across her shoulder. She'd spent the previous days getting the forge accounts in order, setting up a proper ledger, creating a filing system, drafting polite but firm collection letters. Now came the harder part, actually collecting. She started with the easy ones. Farmers who seemed genuinely to have forgotten, who paid up quickly with sheepish apologies. Then she moved to Claude Hayward's hotel. The building was the nicest in Caldera, which wasn't saying much, 2 stories of painted wood with actual glass windows and a covered porch. Inside, a small lobby contained a desk, a few chairs, and a staircase leading up. Behind the desk sat a young man with slicked hair and a vest that had seen better days. "Help you?" he asked, barely looking up from his newspaper. "I'm here to see Mr. Hayward regarding an outstanding invoice." "He's busy. I'll wait." The young man finally looked at her, taking in her worn dress and work-rough hands. "You don't see people without appointments." "Then I'll make an appointment. When's he available?" "He ain't taking new business right now." Margaret set her satchel on the desk with a deliberate thud. "This isn't new business. This is $18 he's owed to Ethan Crow since February for custom ironwork. I have the invoice right here." "Take it up with Crow." "I'm taking it up with Hayward. Now either you get him, or I'll wait here until he comes through that door, and when he does, I'll discuss his unpaid debts loud enough for every person in this lobby to hear." The young man's expression shifted from boredom to irritation. "You threatening me?" "I'm stating facts. Mr. Hayward commissioned work. The work was completed. He hasn't paid. That's theft, no matter how you dress it up." "Lady, you don't know who you're—" "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Margaret opened her satchel, pulled out the invoice. $18 for custom iron railings, delivered and installed March 1st, signed for by Mr. Hayward himself. "Now I can wait here all day, or you can go upstairs and tell him Margaret Hale is here to discuss his account. Your choice." For a long moment they stared at each other. Then the young man stood, muttered something uncomplimentary under his breath, and disappeared up the stairs. He returned 5 minutes later. "Mr. Hayward will see you, 3rd door on the right." Margaret climbed the stairs, her heart pounding but her face calm. This was familiar territory. She'd chased down Thomas's debtors often enough, had learned to project confidence even when she felt anything but. Claude Hayward's office was surprisingly spare. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet. The man himself sat behind the desk, mid-50s, thick through the middle, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once but had gone soft with prosperity. He didn't stand when she entered. "Mrs. Hale, I understand you're here about some confusion regarding an invoice." "There's no confusion. You owe Ethan Crow $18. Hayward leaned back in his chair. "And Crow sent you to collect? Interesting delegation." "I manage his accounts, and according to those accounts, you've been carrying this debt for 3 months." Crow's work was adequate, but there were issues with the installation. One of the railings was slightly crooked. I've been waiting for him to come fix it before I settle the bill. "Did you inform him of this issue?" "I assumed he'd notice." Margaret pulled out a folded paper. "I have his installation notes. They include a clause stating that any complaints must be reported within 2 weeks of installation. You signed it. That was 10 weeks ago." Hayward's expression hardened. "I don't appreciate being ambushed with contract language by some Eastern woman playing at business. And I don't appreciate men who think they can ignore their debts because the person they owe won't push back." Margaret set the invoice on his desk. $18, plus $1 in late fees per the payment terms you agreed to when you commissioned the work. "Late fees," Hayward repeated, his voice dangerous now. "You're charging me late fees?" "Yes, $1 per month past 60 days. It's standard practice." "Standard in Philadelphia, maybe. Not out here." "Out here or back east, a debt's a debt." Margaret met his eyes. $19, Mr. Hayward. You can pay me now, or I can file a complaint with the territorial court in Fort Ellis. Your choice." The silence stretched out, heavy with tension. Hayward's face had gone red, and Margaret could see him calculating whether this was worth fighting, whether she was serious, whether making an enemy of her would cause more problems than just paying. Finally, he opened a drawer, pulled out a cash box, and counted out $19 with sharp, angry movements. He shoved the bills across the desk. "Tell Crow he's lost my business. I'll pass that along." Margaret gathered the money, gave him a receipt, and walked out with her spine straight and her hands steady. It wasn't until she was outside, around the corner from the hotel, that she let herself shake. She returned to the forge as the sun was setting, her satchel now containing nearly $90 in collected debts. Crow looked up from his work as she dismounted, and she handed him the money without preamble. He stared at it. "How much of this came from Hayward?" $18 for the invoice, 1 in late fees." "You charged him late fees?" "Per the contract terms." "Margaret, he's a businessman who thought he could avoid paying because you wouldn't push back. He was wrong." She untied the satchel, pulled out the ledger she'd been updating. The rest came from 6 other customers. 2 paid in full, 4 set up payment plans. I have the details here. Crow took the ledger, flipped through it slowly. When he looked up, his expression was complicated. "You made enemies today." "I collected debts. If that makes enemies, they were never friends to begin with. It's not that simple out here." "Yes, it is. You do good work. You deserve to be paid for it. Everything else is just people trying to convince you otherwise." She moved past him toward the storeroom. "I'm going to wash up. There's beans and salt pork if you want dinner." That night, they ate together at the small table in Crow's living quarters, a cramped space that doubled as storage and living area. The meal was simple, the conversation sparse, but something had shifted. Crow watched her differently now, with a kind of wary respect that hadn't been there before. "You learned that in Philadelphia?" he asked finally. "How to face down men twice your size." "I learned it from being married to a man who couldn't face them himself." Margaret pushed beans around her plate. "Thomas would make promises to creditors, then hide when they came to collect. So I'd have to answer the door, make excuses, negotiate extensions. After a while, I realized most bullies back down if you refuse to be intimidated. And if they don't? Then you deal with the consequences. But at least you dealt with them on your feet instead of your knees." Crow was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hayward's not going to let this go." "Probably not. He'll make trouble." "Let him try." Margaret met his eyes. "I'm not afraid of men like Claude Hayward. I've known plenty of them. They're all the same. They depend on people being too tired or too scared to push back. Take that away, and they're just ordinary cowards dressed up in expensive suits. Crow almost smiled. You might survive out here after all. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Margaret rose early, made coffee, organized the day's work. She handled customers who came to the forge, taking orders, providing estimates, collecting payment. She updated the ledger daily, managed inventory, wrote letters to suppliers in Fort Ellis and beyond. The work left her exhausted in a way that felt clean, purposeful. Her hands, soft from years of keeping house in Philadelphia, developed calluses. Her back stopped aching quite so fiercely. She learned to move through the forge without getting in Crow's way, learned the rhythm of his work, learned when to speak and when silence was better. They talked more now. Not constantly. Crow wasn't built for constant conversation, but in the early mornings over coffee, or in the evenings after the forge cooled. He told her about learning metalwork from his father in Pennsylvania, about the war that took his arm and left the scars across his face, about coming west because he couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes back home. She told him about her daughter's death, about the grief that never quite faded, about Thomas's slow decline from disappointed businessman to bitter drunk, about the morning she'd found him dead in his chair, and her first thought had been relief, horrible, shameful relief, before the guilt crashed in. That doesn't make you a bad person, Crow said when she confessed that. Doesn't it? It makes you human. You can love someone and still be glad when the suffering ends. Both things can be true. Margaret looked at him across the table, this scarred, taciturn man who somehow understood things about her that she'd never spoken aloud, and felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction exactly, though there was some of that too, buried under layers of practicality and caution. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The knowledge that here was someone who'd also been broken by life and chosen to keep going anyway. 5 weeks into her stay, a man arrived at the forge on a lathered horse just after dawn. Young, barely 20, with wild eyes and panic written across his face. Crow, you gotta come. It's the Peterson place. Fire got the barn and it's spreading toward the house. We need every hand. Crow was already moving, grabbing tools, shouting instructions. Margaret, stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone you don't know. I can help. Not with this. Fire's dangerous and you don't know the land. He swung onto his horse. I'll be back when I can. He was gone before she could argue, the young man close behind. Margaret stood in the empty forge, listening to the fading hoofbeats, and felt the silence press in. She'd never been alone here before. Crow was always nearby, always within earshot. Now the isolation of the place hit her fully. 6 miles from town, no neighbors in sight. Surrounded by country, she still barely understood. She forced herself to move. There was work to do, accounts to update, an order to fill for a farmer who'd be by tomorrow. She threw herself into it, trying not to think about fire spreading through dry grass, about Crow riding toward danger with only one arm to protect himself. The hours crawled past. Noon came and went. Margaret made coffee she didn't drink, reorganized shelves that didn't need it, paced the length of the forge like a caged animal. It was late afternoon when she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders, moving fast. She moved to the door, her pulse jumping. 3 men, none of them Crow. The one in front was well-dressed by territory standards. Good boots, a coat that hadn't been mended, a hat that still held its shape. Behind him rode 2 rough-looking men with the kind of faces that said they got paid to intimidate. The well-dressed man dismounted with easy confidence. Mrs. Hale, I presume. Who's asking? Victor Langford. I believe we have business to discuss. The name hit her like cold water. Victor Langford. Thomas's business partner from years ago. The man who'd left the textile venture right before it collapsed. The man who'd written her one letter after Thomas died. Not condolences, but a demand for money he claimed Thomas owed him. She'd ignored that letter. Apparently that had been a mistake. We have no business, Mr. Langford. Whatever issues you had with my late husband died with him. Langford smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. That's not how debt works, Mrs. Hale. Your husband took out a loan using business assets as collateral. When he defaulted, those assets became mine, including the textile equipment he sold, equipment that wasn't his to sell. That was settled years ago. Not to my satisfaction. Langford moved closer, and Margaret fought the urge to back up. Thomas defrauded me of nearly $3,000. I've been trying to recover it through legal channels, but you made that difficult by running away. Imagine my surprise when I heard you'd turned up in Montana territory, making quite a name for yourself. I don't have $3,000. No, but you have land now, 160 acres, filed in your name just last month. That's worth considerably more than $3,000, especially with the right development. Margaret's blood went cold. How do you know about that? I make it my business to know things, Mrs. Hale, and I make it my business to collect what's owed to me. He pulled out a folded document. This is a legal claim against your assets, filed with the territorial court. Either you sign over the property to settle your debt, or I'll take it through legal action. Your choice. That land was never Thomas's. It can't be used to settle his debts. The law disagrees. Marital assets are marital assets, regardless of when they were acquired. You can fight it if you want, but legal battles are expensive, and something tells me you can't afford a lawyer. He held out the document. Sign it. Walk away. Start over somewhere else. It's the smart play. Margaret looked at the paper, then at Langford, then at the two men behind him who'd moved their horses to block any exit. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a trap that had been carefully baited and sprung, and she'd walked right into it. I need time to think, she said. You have until tomorrow. I'm staying at Hayward's Hotel in Caldera. I'm sure you know where that is, given your recent visit. Langford's smile sharpened. Come by noon tomorrow with the signed papers, or I file the legal claim and you lose everything anyway, plus court costs. He remounted, tipped his hat with mock courtesy, and rode away, his men flanking him like guards. Margaret stood in the empty forge yard, the document still in her hand, and felt the careful structure she'd been building collapse around her. Everything, the land, the future, the fragile hope she'd allowed herself to feel, all of it balanced on a legal claim she had no way to fight. Crow returned just after dark, covered in soot and ash, exhausted but unharmed. Margaret met him at the door with water and clean rags. The Petersons? She asked. Lost the barn. Saved the house and most of the livestock. He washed his face, wincing at burns on his hand. Could have been worse. Ethan, we have a problem. She told him everything, about Langford, the claim, the ultimatum. Crow listened in silence, his face getting darker with each sentence. When she finished, he said, That's extortion. That's business, according to him. It's both. Crow stood, paced the small room. This land claim, you said someone filed it in your name without your knowledge. That means the documentation is fraudulent. You could challenge it on those grounds. And admit to fraud myself? That doesn't help. Then we need to figure out who filed it and why, because someone went to a lot of trouble to put you in exactly this position. He stopped pacing. Margaret, I think you've been set up. The letters, the land claim, bringing you out here, it was all designed to create an asset that Langford could seize. The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret sat down slowly, her mind racing through the implications. You think Langford wrote the letters? Arranged everything? Or paid someone to? He knew you were broke in Philadelphia, knew you couldn't fight him there. So he created a situation where you'd think you were getting something for nothing, and then he'd take it all back plus whatever equity the land generated. But how would he know I'd fall for it? Because desperate people take desperate chances. You said it yourself, you had nothing to lose. Crow's voice was grim. Except now you do. Now you have something to lose, and he's counting on you caring enough about it to sign it over instead of fighting. Margaret looked at the document still clutched in her hand. What if I don't sign? What if I let him file the legal claim? Then you spend months in court, probably lose anyway, and end up with nothing plus legal debts you can't pay. So I'm trapped. Looks that way. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the night pressed close, full of sounds Margaret was only beginning to recognize. Wind through grass, the distant call of an owl, the soft movement of the horses in their corral. Finally, Margaret said, There's a third option. Crow looked at her. What? I marry you. The words fell between them like stones into water. Crow stared at her as if she'd started speaking a foreign language. What? Langford's claim is based on marital assets, Thomas's debts passing to me as his widow. But if I remarry, my assets become my new husband's property under territorial law. Langford would have to go after you instead, and you have no connection to Thomas's debts. His claim falls apart. Margaret, that's practical, strategic. It solves the immediate problem. It's insane. Crow stood, moved to the window. You can't marry someone just to dodge a legal claim. Well, people marry for worse reasons. At least this one is honest about what it is. A business arrangement that benefits us both. How does it benefit me? You get someone running your business who's already increased your income by 30%. You get consistent help with work that needs two hands. You get... She broke off, searching for something that sounded less mercenary. You get someone who won't leave when things get hard. I'm good at that, at least. Staying. Pooh. Crow turned to face her, his scarred face unreadable in the lamplight. And what do you get besides keeping land that might not even be legally yours? A home. A purpose. A partnership with someone who sees me as capable instead of broken. She stood, moved closer. Ethan, I'm not asking for romance. I'm not asking for anything beyond what we already have. Two people working together to survive. But this way, we both get to keep doing it. The alternative is Langford taking everything and me ending up right back where I started, except 1,000 miles from nowhere. This is crazy. Probably, but so was coming out here in the first place, and that worked out. She held his gaze. I know I'm asking a lot. I know this isn't what you wanted when you agreed to help me. But we're out of time and options, and this is the only play that keeps us both standing. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, if we do this, it has to look real. Langford will check. If he thinks it's a sham marriage just to dodge his claim, he'll challenge it. Then we make it real. Not in every way necessarily, but real enough that no one questions it. Margaret, tomorrow at noon, I can walk into Hayward's Hotel and sign away everything I've built here. Or I can walk in engaged to marry Ethan Crow with a witness and a date set and watch Langford's claim disintegrate. She took a breath. It's your choice. I won't force this on you, but I need to know now because time's running out. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications and consequences. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window shutters. The lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Finally, Crow exhaled. If we're doing this, we do it right. Full ceremony, in front of witnesses. Nothing half-hearted or fake. Relief flooded through Margaret, so intense it made her dizzy. Agreed. And when this is over, when Langford's gone and the claim is settled, if you want out, I won't stop you. Consider it an escape clause. I won't want out. You don't know that. Yes, Margaret said quietly. I do. They stood there in the lamplight, two damaged people who'd somehow found themselves standing at the edge of something that might save them both or might destroy whatever fragile trust they'd built. But the alternative was certain destruction, and between certain and possible, the choice was obvious. Tomorrow, they'd walk into Caldera and announce their engagement. Tomorrow, they'd face Victor Langford and whatever trap he'd built for her. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, in this small room with its flickering lamp and scarred walls, they made a promise that was as practical as it was desperate, as calculated as it was genuine. And somewhere out there, in the ruins of the Brennan homestead, the mysterious J.D. who'd brought them to this moment probably knew exactly what they were about to do. The question was whether he'd planned for it, or whether, for once, they'd managed to surprise him. They left for Caldera at first light, neither having slept much. Margaret wore her least worn dress, the dark blue one she'd saved for something important, though she'd never imagined it would be this. Crow had shaved, put on a clean shirt, and looked almost uncomfortable in clothes that weren't covered in soot and ash. The ride was quiet. Not the comfortable silence they'd developed over weeks of working together, but the tense quiet of two people about to walk into a situation neither fully understood. Margaret kept her hands steady on the reins, but her mind raced through scenarios. What Langford might say. How Hayward would react, whether this desperate gamble would hold up under scrutiny. Second thoughts? Crow asked as Caldera came into view. 1,000 of them. You? About the same. He glanced at her. We can still turn back, face Langford another way. What other way? You said it yourself. His claim is legal enough to tie us up in court for months. We don't have months. No, Crow agreed. We don't. They rode directly to Ruth Palmer's store. If they were going to make this announcement, better to start with someone who might actually be on their side. Ruth was sweeping the porch when they arrived, and her eyebrows rose at the sight of them together. "This looks official," she said, leaning on her broom. "It is." Margaret dismounted, straightened her skirt. "Ethan and I are getting married. We wanted you to be the first to know." Ruth's expression didn't change for a long moment. Then she said, "Come inside, all of you. We're going to have a conversation." The store was empty of customers. Ruth locked the door, turned the sign to closed, and gestured them toward the back room where she kept her private quarters. She poured 3 cups of coffee with deliberate slowness, then sat down and fixed them both with a look that could strip paint. "Now," she said, "tell me what's really going on." Margaret looked at Crow. He nodded slightly. "Your call." So she told Ruth everything, the whole story, from the first letter to Langford's appearance yesterday. Ruth listened without interrupting, her weathered face giving nothing away. When Margaret finished, Ruth took a long drink of coffee. "So you're marrying him to dodge a legal claim?" "I'm marrying him because it's the only option that lets me keep what I've built." "What you've built in 6 weeks?" "Yes." Ruth looked at Crow. "And you're going along with this?" "I am." "Why?" Crow set down his cup. "Because Langford's claim is extortion dressed up as business. Because Margaret's worked harder in 6 weeks than most people work in 6 months. And because—" He paused. "Because she deserves better than having everything taken by a man who views people as assets to liquidate." "That's real pretty," Ruth said. "Doesn't change the fact that you're both walking into a legal minefield. Langford's not stupid. He'll challenge this marriage as fraudulent. You'll end up in court anyway, except now you'll be legally bound to each other." "Then we make sure it's not fraudulent," Margaret said. "We make it real in every way that matters legally." Ruth studied them both. "You two even like each other?" "Yes," Margaret said. At the same moment, Crow said, "That's not relevant." Ruth snorted. "Well, at least you're honest about how much you've thought this through." She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the street. "Langford's staying at Hayward's Hotel. Those two have history, did some business together back in the gold rush days. If you're planning to face Langford down, you should know he's not working alone. Hayward's backing him." Margaret's stomach dropped. "How do you know?" "Because Hayward's been asking questions about you all week. About your land claim, about where you're staying, about your connection to Crow. He's not the subtle type. Everyone in town knows something's brewing." Ruth turned back to them. "Whatever you're planning to do, do it public. Make sure there are witnesses. Because if this goes wrong, you'll want people who can testify that you acted in good faith." "Will you witness?" Margaret asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then she sighed. "Yeah, I'll witness. Someone needs to make sure you two don't get yourselves killed." They walked together to Hayward's Hotel, Ruth on one side, Crow on the other, Margaret in the middle, feeling like she was marching toward either salvation or disaster, and wouldn't know which until it was too late to turn back. The hotel lobby was busy, unusual for late morning. Men Margaret didn't recognize stood in clusters, talking in low voices. The young clerk behind the desk looked nervous, his eyes darting between the newcomers and the stairs. Claude Hayward descended those stairs with Victor Langford beside him, both men wearing the satisfied expressions of people who'd already won. Behind them came Langford's 2 enforcers, and behind them 3 more men in suits who had the look of lawyers or government officials. Langford smiled when he saw Margaret. "Mrs. Hale, punctual. I appreciate that." His gaze shifted to Crow and Ruth. "Though I expected you to come alone. I came to deliver news," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. "I won't be signing your document." Langford's smile didn't waver. "That's unfortunate, but not unexpected. Mr. Garrett here," he gestured to one of the suited men, "is a territorial magistrate. He'll be filing the legal claim against your assets this afternoon. You'll have 30 days to respond, after which the court will seize the property and sell it at auction to settle your debts." "No, they won't," Margaret said, "because as of today I'm engaged to marry Ethan Crow. Under territorial law, my assets will transfer to him upon marriage, which means your claim against my late husband's debts becomes invalid." The smile finally cracked. Langford's eyes went cold. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. The wedding will take place within the week, with proper witnesses and documentation. You're welcome to attend." "This is fraud," Langford said flatly. "A sham marriage designed specifically to evade legitimate debt collection. Mr. Garrett, this is exactly the kind of manipulation I warned you about." The magistrate, Garrett, stepped forward. He was older, gray-haired, with the tired expression of someone who'd seen too many territory disputes. "Mrs. Hale, are you claiming this is a genuine engagement, not a strategic maneuver?" "I'm claiming I'm marrying a man I respect and trust. Whether that's strategic or not is irrelevant. People marry for all kinds of reasons, and the law doesn't require romance as a condition." "But it does require good faith," Garrett said. "If this marriage is determined to be fraudulent, entered into solely to evade legal obligations, it can be annulled and the original claim will stand." "Then investigate," Crow said, his voice cutting through the room. "Talk to anyone in Caldera or Fort Ellis. Margaret's been working at my forge for 6 weeks. She's been managing my accounts, living on my property, building a partnership. We're not strangers throwing together a fake marriage. We're people who've been working toward this for weeks." "Working toward marriage?" Hayward's voice dripped skepticism. "Or working toward evading Mr. Langford's legitimate claim?" "Both," Margaret said. "I'm not pretending I'm marrying Ethan purely out of love. I'm marrying him because he's offered me partnership, respect, and a future I can build with my own hands. If that also happens to protect me from a man trying to steal property that was never part of my late husband's estate, then that's just practical thinking." "The property was claimed in your name while you were still legally connected to your late husband's debts," Langford said. "That makes it marital property, subject to those debts." "Except I didn't claim that property," Margaret shot back. "Someone filed those papers without my knowledge or consent." "Which means the claim itself is fraudulent. Which means your legal standing is based on fraud. Which means you have no legitimate claim at all." The room went very quiet. Langford's face had gone red, and Hayward looked like he'd bitten into something rotten. Garrett pulled out a small notebook. "You're saying you didn't file the land claim yourself?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. I arrived in Montana Territory 6 weeks ago with no knowledge of any property. When I went to the Fort Ellis land office, I discovered someone had filed a claim in my name using forged documentation." Margaret pulled out the letters from her bag. "I was lured here by letters from someone calling himself James Dalton, who doesn't exist. Someone went to elaborate lengths to create a situation where I'd have an asset that Mr. Langford could then seize. I believe that someone was Mr. Langford himself." "That's absurd," Langford said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Is it? You claim my late husband owed you money from a business deal that collapsed 8 years ago. You've been pursuing that debt ever since, despite having no legal documentation to support it. Then suddenly, I appear in Montana Territory with property you immediately move to claim. That's not coincidence, that's conspiracy." Garrett was writing quickly now. "Do you have evidence supporting this theory?" "I have the letters. I have the fraudulent land claim. And I have the timing. Mr. Langford appeared less than 24 hours after I'd verified the claim existed. How did he know I was here unless he'd been tracking my movements?" "I heard through business contacts," Langford said tightly. "Montana Territory isn't that big. Word travels." "Word travels about a 48-year-old widow filing a land claim?" Margaret shook her head. "No. You knew because you arranged it. You created the asset so you could seize it. You have no proof of that." "No," Margaret agreed, "but I don't need proof to refuse to sign your document. And I don't need proof to marry Ethan Crow and transfer my assets to him, which ends your claim entirely." Garrett looked between them, his pen hovering over his notebook. "This is beyond my authority to resolve. If Mrs. Hale is alleging fraud in the original land claim, that needs to be investigated by the Territorial Land Office. If Mr. Langford is alleging fraud in this marriage, that requires a separate legal proceeding. I'm not filing any claims today until both issues are examined properly." "That could take months," Langford said. "Yes," Garrett agreed. "It could. In the meantime, Mrs. Hale's property remains under her control, or her husband's, if she marries, until the court determines otherwise." He closed his notebook. "I suggest you both hire lawyers. This is going to get complicated." Langford's face had gone from red to almost purple. "This is outrageous. I have legitimate business interests here." "Then document them," Garrett said tiredly. "Provide the court with evidence of the original debt evidence of your claim to the property, and evidence that this marriage is fraudulent. Until then, my hands are tied." He nodded to Margaret and Crow. "Good day." He left, taking 2 of the suited men with him. The third, clearly Langford's lawyer, leaned in to whisper urgently in his client's ear. Margaret stood very still, hardly daring to believe they'd actually pulled it off. Not won, not yet, but survived the immediate confrontation. Bought themselves time. Hayward broke the silence. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Mrs. Hale." "I made that enemy the day your friend decided to steal from me," Margaret said. "All I did today was refuse to make it easy for him." She turned and walked out, Crow and Ruth flanking her. Behind them, she could hear Langford's raised voice, Hayward's lower rumble, the lawyer's placating tones. But she didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept walking until they were outside in the bright morning sun. Ruth exhaled hard. "Well, that was something." "Did we win?" Margaret asked. "You survived," Ruth said. "That's not the same thing, but it's not nothing either. Langford's going to fight this. He'll dig into your marriage, try to prove it's fake, drag it through every court in the territory if he has to." "Let him," Crow said. "We'll be ready." They walked back to Ruth's store in silence. Once inside, Ruth poured whiskey instead of coffee and pushed glasses across the counter. "When are you actually doing this?" she asked. "The wedding." Margaret looked at Crow. "Soon. This week. The longer we wait, the more ammunition we give Langford." 3 days, Crow said. "That gives us time to file proper documentation, get witnesses lined up, make it look legitimate." "It is legitimate," Margaret said quietly. "You know what I mean." Ruth raised her glass. "Then I guess we're planning a wedding. Though I've got to say, this is the strangest courtship I've ever witnessed." They drank, the whiskey burning warm and steadying. Through the window, Margaret could see people gathering in the street. Word was already spreading about the confrontation at the hotel. By evening, everyone in Caldera would know. By tomorrow, Fort Ellis would know. The gossip would spread like wildfire, which was exactly what they needed. The more public this was, the harder it would be for Langford to claim fraud. "I need to get back," Crow said. "I've got work piling up." "I'll come with you," Margaret said. "Actually," Ruth interrupted, "you should stay here tonight, both of you staying at the forge right before the wedding. People will talk." "Better if you're properly separated until the ceremony. Makes it look more respectable." "Ruth, I think she's right," Crow said. "Langford's going to be watching everything we do. Let's not give him easy ammunition." He looked at Margaret. "I'll come back tomorrow. We'll sort out the details then." He left before she could argue. Margaret watched him ride away, then turned to find Ruth studying her with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You really going through with this?" Ruth asked. "Yes." "You sure that's what you want? Not just what you need?" Margaret thought about the question, really thought about it. About the weeks at the forge, the quiet mornings, the slow building of trust between 2 people who'd both been broken by life. About Crow's steady competence, his dry humor, the way he'd looked at her in the lamplight last night when she'd proposed this arrangement. "I think," she said slowly, "that what I want and what I need have been the same thing for a while now. I just didn't recognize it until circumstances forced my hand." Ruth nodded. "That's honest, at least. Come on, I'll show you where you're sleeping. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Margaret and Ruth worked together to arrange the ceremony, securing the courthouse in Fort Ellis, filing the proper documentation, gathering witnesses. Word spread quickly, and people Margaret barely knew stopped by the store to offer congratulations or thinly veiled curiosity about the hasty wedding. Crow came by each afternoon, and they'd sit in Ruth's back room planning logistics with the business-like precision of generals preparing for battle. Because that's what it was, really. A battle disguised as a wedding. "Langford's hired investigators," Crow reported on the second day. "They've been asking questions in Fort Ellis. About you, about me, about how long we've known each other." "What are people saying?" "Truth, mostly. That you've been working at my forge. That we've been seen together regularly. That this isn't exactly a whirlwind romance, but isn't completely out of nowhere either." He paused. "Daniel Palmer mentioned you to a few people. Said you seem practical and hardworking. That helps." "What about Hayward?" "Spreading rumors, calling it a sham, saying you're a con artist from back east. But Ruth's been pushing back, and she's got more credibility in this town than he does. On the third day, Margaret borrowed a dress from Ruth. Simple gray wool, the best either of them owned, and they rode together to Fort Ellis. Crow met them at the courthouse steps, wearing a suit that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in a decade, but was clean and properly fitted. His scars seemed more prominent in the bright sunlight, but his eyes were steady. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," Margaret said. The courthouse clerk who'd performed the ceremony was matter-of-fact about it, reading through the legal language with the speed of long practice. Margaret and Crow stood side by side, their hands not quite touching, and repeated the words that would bind them legally, if not yet emotionally. Ruth stood witness, along with Daniel Palmer and 2 ranchers Crow had done business with. Small gathering, but legitimate. Public enough to matter. When the clerk pronounced them married, there was an awkward moment where Crow clearly wasn't sure if he should kiss her. Margaret solved it by offering her hand to shake instead. He took it, his calloused palm warm against hers, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe. Commitment to this strange partnership they'd built. They signed the documents. The witnesses signed. The clerk stamped everything with official seals and filed copies with the territorial records. And just like that, Margaret Hale became Margaret Crow. The small celebration afterward at Ruth's store was subdued but genuine. People came by to offer congratulations, some curious, some supportive, a few clearly skeptical but polite enough not to say so. Margaret accepted it all with practiced grace, playing the role of modest new bride while her mind cataloged who seemed friendly and who seemed likely to report back to Langford. Crow stayed close, not touching her but present, solid. When someone asked how they'd met, he told the truth. She'd come looking for information about the Brennan property. He'd helped her. One thing had led to another. Simple, believable. As evening fell and the guests dispersed, Crow pulled Margaret aside. "We should head back," he said quietly. "Long ride, and I've got work tomorrow." They said goodbye to Ruth, who hugged Margaret with surprising fierceness and whispered, "You did good today. Now comes the hard part, making it last." The ride back to the forge was quiet. Full dark by the time they arrived, the stars overwhelming in their brightness. Crow dismounted first, then helped Margaret down. "You can keep the back room," he said. "I'll stay in the forge like I said." "Ethan, it's fine. We don't need to pretend when it's just us." But Margaret caught his arm before he could walk away. "This isn't pretend. Maybe it started that way, but standing there today saying those words, that felt real to me. Did it feel real to you?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was rough. "Yeah, it did." "Then maybe we don't have to figure everything out tonight. Maybe we just take it slow and see what this becomes." Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Slow. I can do slow." They went inside together, and Margaret made coffee while Crow built up the fire. Domestic rituals they'd developed over weeks, now carrying different weight because of words spoken in a courthouse and signatures on legal documents. "Langford's not going to let this go," Crow said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I know. He'll come at us harder now, try to prove fraud, dig into every detail of our lives, make this as difficult as possible. I know that too." "And you're still okay with this?" Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee, handed him one. "I'm married to you, Ethan, for better or worse, legally binding. So yes, I'm okay with this. More than okay, actually." He studied her face in the firelight. "You're a strange woman, Margaret Crow." "I've been called worse." She smiled. "Besides, you're not exactly conventional yourself." "Fair point." He raised his cup in a slight toast. "To strange partnerships and unlikely marriages. To survival," Margaret amended, "and maybe something better if we're lucky." They drank, and outside the forge walls, Montana territory stretched into darkness, vast, indifferent, full of threats and possibilities. But inside, 2 people who'd found each other through deception and desperation sat together in the firelight, beginning to build something that might actually last. The next morning brought the inevitable response. A legal courier arrived from Fort Ellis with documents. Langford's formal challenge to the marriage's legitimacy, filed with the territorial court. Pages of accusations, fraud, conspiracy to evade legal debt, misrepresentation of assets. A hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Margaret read through it all while Crow worked the forge. When she finished, she set the papers aside and got back to work on the accounts. There was nothing to be gained by panicking, and plenty to be lost by stopping. Over the following days, life settled into a new rhythm. Margaret still managed the forge business, still handled customers and accounts. But now there was a different edge to it. She was the wife of the proprietor, not just hired help. People treated her differently, with either more respect or more suspicion depending on their view of the marriage. Crow maintained his usual routine, but Margaret noticed small changes. He made sure to eat meals with her instead of grabbing food whenever he remembered. He asked her opinion on business decisions rather than just making them unilaterally. He started teaching her basic metalwork, not because she needed to know it, but because sharing his craft seemed to matter to him. "You're a terrible student," he said one afternoon, watching her mangle a simple bracket. "No patience for the heat timing." "I'm used to things I can calculate in advance," Margaret said. "Metal's unpredictable." "Not unpredictable. Just requires different thinking. You watch the color, feel the resistance, learn to read what it's telling you." He took the piece from her, reheated it, demonstrated the proper striking technique. "Everything speaks if you pay attention." Margaret tried again, this time watching more than thinking. The metal shifted under her hammer, began to take shape. Not perfect, but functional. "Better," Crow said. They worked side by side as the afternoon faded into evening, and Margaret realized with some surprise that she was happy. Not deliriously so, not without worries or complications, but genuinely content in a way she couldn't remember being in years. The hearing loomed closer. Langford's investigators continued their work, interviewing everyone who'd had contact with Margaret or Crow. They talked to Ruth, to Daniel Palmer, to customers at the forge. They dug through land records, scrutinized the marriage documentation, built their case piece by piece. Margaret and Crow did the same. They gathered statements from witnesses attesting to their working relationship, documented Margaret's contributions to the forge business, built a timeline showing how their partnership had developed naturally over weeks. Ruth helped coordinate their defense, using her network of contacts to gather information about Langford's business practices. What they found wasn't pretty. A history of aggressive debt collection, questionable business dealings, partnerships with men of dubious reputation, including Claude Hayward, whose own business practices didn't bear close examination. "This is good," Margaret said, reading through Ruth's notes. "Shows a pattern of predatory behavior." "It's circumstantial," Crow cautioned. "Won't prove he orchestrated the letter scheme." "No, but it establishes character. Shows the court he's not an honest businessman seeking legitimate debt repayment. He's someone who exploits vulnerable people for profit." The night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the back room, listening to the familiar sounds of the forge cooling, the horses moving in their corral, Crow's quiet movements as he worked late on some project. Finally, she got up and went to find him. He was in the forge, working by lamplight on what looked like a set of hinges. He looked up when she entered but didn't stop working. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "Too much thinking." "Yeah." He quenched the piece he'd been working on, the hiss and steam filling the space between them. "Margaret, whatever happens tomorrow, we'll deal with it. I was going to say, whatever happens, you don't have to stay married to me if things go wrong. If Langford wins, if the court rules against us, I won't hold you to vows spoken under duress." Margaret moved closer, close enough to see the old burns on his face clearly in the lamplight, close enough to meet his eyes directly. "Those vows weren't spoken under duress. They were spoken because I chose to speak them. Same as I'm choosing right now to tell you that win or lose tomorrow, I'm not going anywhere." "You can't know that." "I can, because I've spent enough of my life being pushed around by circumstances and other people's choices. This, you, me, this forge, that land, this is my choice. The first real one I've made in years. I'm not giving it up without a fight." Crow's expression softened. "You're stubborn as hell, you know that?" "So are you. We're well matched that way." He almost smiled, then moving carefully, he reached out with his single hand and brushed a strand of hair from her face. It was the first deliberately tender gesture he'd made, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for choosing this, for choosing me. Thank you for being worth choosing." They stood there in the dim forge, surrounded by tools and metal and the smell of coal smoke, and something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not yet, Maybe not ever in the way poets wrote about it, but partnership, respect, the beginning of genuine affection built on shared struggle and mutual determination. Tomorrow they'd face Langford and the court. Tomorrow, they'd fight for the life they were building together. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply two people who'd found each other through the most unlikely circumstances and decided that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The Fort Ellis courthouse was packed. Margaret hadn't expected that. She'd imagined a quiet hearing, just lawyers and the magistrate. Instead, it seemed half the territory had shown up, filling benches and standing along the walls. News traveled fast out here, and apparently a dispute between an Eastern widow and a wealthy businessman made for good entertainment. Victor Langford sat at the front with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Briggs, who'd come from Denver specifically for this case. Langford looked confident, almost relaxed, like a man who knew the outcome before it started. Margaret sat beside Crow at the opposite table, Ruth behind them in the first row. They had no lawyer, couldn't afford one, so Margaret would represent herself. She'd spent the past 3 weeks preparing, reading through every legal text she could find, memorizing precedents and procedures. It wouldn't be enough, probably, but it would have to do. Magistrate Garrett entered, and the room quieted. He looked older than he had at the hotel confrontation, tired lines deepening around his eyes. This hearing concerns a challenge to the validity of a marriage between Margaret Crow, formerly Hale, and Ethan Crow, Garrett began. Mr. Langford alleges said marriage was contracted fraudulently to evade legitimate debt collection. Mrs. Crow maintains the marriage is genuine, and Mr. Langford's claim itself is based on fraudulent documentation. We'll hear arguments from both sides, then I'll make a determination. He looked at Briggs. Counselor, you may begin. Briggs stood, radiating practiced authority. Your Honor, the facts here are clear. Mrs. Crow arrived in Montana Territory 6 weeks ago. Within days, she discovered a land claim filed in her name, property with significant value. When my client, Mr. Langford, attempted to collect on legitimate debts owed by Mrs. Crow's late husband, she immediately, and I mean within 24 hours, arranged a marriage designed solely to transfer assets beyond Mr. Langford's legal reach. He pulled out documents, began walking through Langford's case. The timeline of Margaret's arrival, the land claim filing, Langford's appearance, the hasty engagement. He made it sound calculated, mercenary, exactly the kind of fraud the law was designed to prevent. Furthermore, Briggs continued, investigation reveals that Mrs. Crow and Mr. Crow barely knew each other. They met perhaps twice before this alleged engagement. There was no courtship, no established relationship, nothing to suggest genuine marital intent. This was a business transaction dressed up as a marriage to circumvent legal obligations. He went on for 20 minutes, building a case that sounded damning because parts of it were true. Margaret had married quickly. She had done it to protect assets. The relationship with Crow was unconventional at best. But the whole truth was more complicated than Briggs's neat narrative, and Margaret intended to make sure Garrett heard it. When Briggs finally sat down, Garrett looked at Margaret. Mrs. Crow, your response? Margaret stood, her hands steady despite the eyes on her. Your Honor, Mr. Briggs's timeline is accurate but incomplete. Yes, I arrived 6 weeks ago. Yes, I discovered a land claim filed in my name, but that claim was fraudulent, filed by someone using forged documentation without my knowledge or consent. I didn't come to Montana Territory seeking property. I came because I was lured here by letters from someone calling himself James Dalton. She pulled out the letters, worn from handling, and submitted them as evidence. These letters promised partnership and opportunity. They were detailed, convincing, and completely false. James Dalton doesn't exist. Someone created an elaborate deception to bring me here, and I believe that someone was working with or for Mr. Langford. Briggs was on his feet immediately. Objection, pure speculation. Mrs. Crow has no evidence connecting my client to any letters. Sustained, Garrett said. Stick to facts you can prove, Mrs. Crow. Margaret nodded. The fact is, someone invested significant time and money bringing me here and setting up that land claim. Why? I had no money, no prospects, unless the goal was to create an asset that could then be seized to satisfy alleged debts. Alleged debts that are thoroughly documented, Briggs interjected. Are they? Margaret turned to face him directly. Mr. Langford claims my late husband owed him $3,000 from a business deal 8 years ago, but he's never produced a signed contract, promissory note, or any contemporaneous documentation. He has invoices he claims weren't paid, but no proof those invoices weren't disputed or that Thomas actually agreed to the charges. The business partnership is a matter of record, Briggs said, a partnership that Mr. Langford left before it collapsed, conveniently avoiding the losses while now claiming he's owed for investments made before his departure. Margaret looked at Garrett. Your Honor, I've spent 20 years managing business accounts. I know what legitimate debt documentation looks like. Mr. Langford doesn't have it because the debt either doesn't exist or was settled years ago. Garrett made a note. That's a matter for separate proceedings. Today we're determining marriage validity. Address that, please. Margaret took a breath. I married Ethan Crow because Mr. Langford left me no choice. He appeared with a legal claim designed to seize property I didn't even know I had, with a deadline that gave me less than 24 hours to respond. Marriage was the only legal option available to protect myself from what I believed, and still believe, is extortion. So you admit the marriage was strategic, Briggs said. I admit it was necessary, but necessary doesn't mean fraudulent. Margaret gestured to Crow, who'd remained silent throughout. I'd been working at Ethan's forge for weeks before Mr. Langford appeared, learning his business, managing accounts, building a partnership based on mutual respect and shared work. When we married, we formalized something that was already developing naturally. Naturally, Briggs repeated with clear skepticism. You expect this court to believe a 48-year-old widow and a scarred, one-armed blacksmith fell in love over accounting ledgers? The contempt in his voice made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. Margaret saw Crow's jaw tighten, but he didn't react otherwise. I expect this court to recognize that marriage takes many forms, Margaret said carefully. Not all of them involve romantic love. Some are based on partnership, practical compatibility, mutual benefit. The law doesn't require passion. It requires good faith intent to build a life together, which we have. Good faith intent developed in the 24 hours between Mr. Langford's claim and your engagement announcement? Briggs shook his head. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of transparent fraud the court should reject. Garrett was quiet for a moment, studying his notes. Then he looked at Crow. Mr. Crow, you've been silent throughout this. I'd like to hear from you directly. Why did you agree to this marriage? Crow stood slowly. He wasn't comfortable speaking in public. Margaret could see that in the tension across his shoulders, the careful way he chose his position. But his voice was steady when he spoke. I agreed because Margaret deserved better than being robbed by a man using the law as a weapon. Because in 6 weeks, she worked harder and more honestly than most people I've known in 12 years out here. And because when I looked at what we were building together, the partnership, the shared work, the trust, it seemed natural to make it official. Natural to make it official within hours of a legal threat? Garrett asked. Natural to protect something worth protecting. The timing was forced by Langford, not by us. But the substance, what we're building, who we are together, that's real. Crow paused. I'm not a man who makes commitments lightly, Your Honor. Lost too much already to risk more on something I don't believe in. I believe in this. In her. In what we can build if given the chance. The room was very quiet. Even Briggs seemed momentarily at a loss for his usual sharp response. Garrett made another note. Mrs. Crow, you mentioned the land claim was fraudulent. Do you have evidence supporting that? The signature on the filing documents isn't mine. It's close. Whoever forged it was skilled. But it's not my handwriting. Margaret pulled out the claim documents alongside several letters she'd written. Compare them. The formation of certain letters is different. The pressure patterns. It's a good forgery, but it's still a forgery. Garrett examined the documents for a long moment. This isn't my area of expertise. I'd need a handwriting expert to make a definitive determination. Then order one, Margaret said. Have the documents examined properly. Because if that signature is proven fraudulent, Mr. Langford's entire claim collapses. He's trying to seize property I never legally claimed, based on debts that may not exist, using a marriage challenge as his weapon because the underlying facts don't support him. Your Honor, this is a deflection, Briggs argued. Whether the land claim is legitimate is separate from whether this marriage is fraudulent. Actually, it's not separate at all, Margaret countered. The marriage only looks suspicious if you accept Mr. Langford's premise that I was trying to hide legitimately claimed property. But if the property claim itself is fraudulent, if I was manipulated into a situation where I appeared to have assets I never actually possessed, then marrying to protect myself from that manipulation isn't fraud. It's self-defense. Garrett rubbed his temples. This is getting complex. I need to consider. The courtroom doors opened, and a man Margaret didn't recognize entered. Middle-aged, weathered, with the careful posture of someone used to being noticed. He walked directly to the front, handed a sealed envelope to Garrett. Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor. I'm Robert Chen, land surveyor and records clerk from the Territorial Office. I was asked to investigate certain irregularities in land claim documentation. I believe my findings are relevant to these proceedings. Langford's face had gone very still. Beside him, Briggs stood. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't notified of any investigation. Neither was I, Garrett said, opening the envelope. He read in silence for a long moment, his expression growing darker. Then he looked up at Chen. You're certain of these findings? Completely certain, Your Honor. I've been investigating suspicious claim filings for 3 months. This particular case showed multiple red flags. Explain for the record. Chen moved to the center of the room, speaking with the practiced clarity of someone who'd testified before. The land claim filed in Margaret Hale's name was part of a larger pattern I've been tracking. Over the past year, someone has been filing fraudulent claims on abandoned or disputed properties, then immediately selling or transferring those claims to third parties for profit. The signature patterns are consistent across multiple filings, same forger, different names. Margaret's pulse quickened. This was bigger than she'd realized. In Mrs. Hale's case, Chen continued, the claim was filed using forged documentation, then immediately flagged in our system with a note about disputed ownership and pending debt collection, which was unusual. We don't typically track private debts in land claim files. Someone wanted to make sure that when Mrs. Hale discovered the claim, there would already be a legal challenge attached to it. Who filed the original claim? Garrett asked. That's where it gets interesting. The filing came through a courier service in Denver. I traced it back through 3 intermediaries before I found the source. Chen pulled out another document. A man named Samuel Voss. He's a known associate of Claude Hayward and has done similar work for him in the past. Filing claims. Handling transactions that Hayward doesn't want directly connected to his name. The courtroom erupted. Hayward, who'd been sitting near the back, stood abruptly. This is slander. I had nothing to do with— Sit down, Mr. Hayward, Garrett said sharply. You'll have a chance to respond. He looked at Chen. Do you have evidence connecting Hayward to these fraudulent filings? I have a paper trail showing payments from Hayward to Voss corresponding to the timing of multiple fraudulent claims. I have testimony from Voss himself. He's currently in custody in Denver, and in exchange for leniency, he's providing detailed information about the scheme. Chen laid out more documents, payment records, correspondence, testimony transcripts. The picture that emerged was damning. Hayward had been running a land fraud operation for over a year, targeting vulnerable people and creating situations where he could profit from their desperation. And Mr. Langford? Garrett asked quietly. Voss's testimony indicates that Langford approached Hayward specifically about Margaret Hale, provided information about her circumstances, her late husband's debts. Hayward then arranged the fraudulent claim and the letter scheme to bring her to Montana Territory, creating an asset that Langford could seize. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. Everything, the letters, the land claim, Langford's timely appearance, all of it had been orchestrated, not just a con but conspiracy. Langford was on his feet. This is absurd. I met with Hayward regarding legitimate business interests, nothing more. If he engaged in fraud, that's his crime, not mine. Voss has detailed notes of your meetings, Chen said calmly, including specific instructions about how to craft letters that would appeal to a widow with business experience, how to create a land claim that would look legitimate enough to lure her out here, but fraudulent enough to be challenged. You knew exactly what Hayward was doing because you paid him to do it. I paid him for consulting services. You paid him to defraud Margaret Hale so you could seize assets and claim it was legitimate debt collection. Chen turned to Garrett. I have copies of all documentation for the court's review. Additionally, the territorial marshal has been notified. Both Mr. Hayward and Mr. Langford should expect formal charges within days. Garrett's expression was granite. Mr. Langford, Mr. Hayward, you're both ordered to remain in the territory pending investigation. If either of you attempts to leave, you'll be arrested immediately. He looked at Margaret. Mrs. Crow, it appears you were the victim of an elaborate fraud designed to create false assets that could then be seized. The land claim in your name is void. However, Margaret's stomach dropped at that word. However, Garrett continued, the property in question, the former Brennan homestead, is legally abandoned. No one has successfully claimed it since the Brennan family departed. If you wish to file a legitimate claim, you're free to do so. The filing fees will be waived given the circumstances. Relief washed through Margaret so intensely she had to grip the table for support. As for the marriage, Garrett said, looking between her and Crow, I find no evidence of fraud. The marriage may have been prompted by Mr. Langford's threats, but it appears to be a genuine partnership built over weeks of working together. Strategic, yes, but strategy doesn't invalidate sincerity. He brought his gavel down once. The challenge is dismissed. The marriage stands. We're adjourned. The courtroom exploded into noise. Langford was shouting at Briggs. Hayward was trying to push toward the exit. Territorial marshals were moving forward to intercept both men. People crowded around Margaret, offering congratulations or asking questions or just wanting to be part of the drama. Margaret heard none of it. She turned to Crow, who was standing very still, looking like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. We won, she said. Yeah. His voice was rough. We did. Then Ruth was there, pulling Margaret into a fierce hug. Never doubted you for a second. Well, maybe a few seconds, but you did it. Daniel Palmer was shaking Crow's hand, other ranchers and businessmen crowding around to offer respect to a man they'd largely ignored before. The territory respected winners, and Crow had just won publicly. It took almost an hour to extract themselves from the courthouse. By the time they made it outside, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. Margaret stood on the courthouse steps and just breathed, letting it sink in. It was over. Not just the hearing, but the threat, the uncertainty, the constant weight of knowing everything could be taken away. Langford would face charges. Hayward's scheme was exposed. The land was hers, truly hers, to claim legitimately. What do we do now? Crow asked quietly. Margaret looked at him, this scarred, steady man who'd taken a chance on a desperate stranger and somehow ended up married to her. Now we go home. We file that land claim properly. And we start building. They rode back to the forge as twilight deepened into full night. Ruth had insisted on celebrating, but Margaret begged off. She was exhausted, emotionally wrung out, needing quiet more than company. Ruth understood, made them promise to come to dinner once things settled. At the forge, Crow built up the fire while Margaret made coffee. The familiar rituals felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that they weren't temporary anymore. This was their life, their partnership, their future. I've been thinking, Crow said, cradling his coffee cup, about the homestead. What we'd need to make it livable. Lumber, obviously. Windows. A stove. Probably $300 minimum. I've got about $200 saved. With what you collected in accounts and what we'll make over the next few months, we could start work by fall. Margaret smiled. Already planning? Someone needs to. You're too busy celebrating victories to think practically. I'm thinking plenty practically. I'm thinking we need to file that claim tomorrow. Thinking we need to decide what crops to plant come spring, what livestock we can afford. Thinking about whether we want to rebuild the Brennan house or start fresh. Fresh, Crow said immediately. New foundation, new structure, build it right from the start. Agreed. Margaret set down her cup. Ethan, about the marriage, you don't have to explain. It served its purpose. If you want to dissolve it now that Langford's dealt with, I understand. That's not what I was going to say. Margaret moved closer, close enough to see the firelight reflected in his eyes. I was going to say that standing in that courtroom today, hearing you tell the magistrate you believed in what we're building, that meant something to me. More than just legal strategy. Crow was very still. Yeah? Yeah. And I know we started this backward. Marriage before courtship, legal partnership before emotional one. But maybe that's not wrong. Maybe it's just our way. Our way? Crow repeated. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and touched her face with his calloused hand. I'm not good at pretty words, Margaret. Not good at romance or courtship or any of the things women are supposed to want. I don't want those things. I want a partner who sees me as capable, who trusts me to pull my weight, who doesn't need me to be smaller or quieter or less than I am to feel comfortable. She covered his hand with hers. I want exactly what you've already given me. Then you've got it, for as long as you want it. How about forever? Crow smiled, a real smile this time, unguarded and genuine. Forever works. He kissed her then, careful and tentative, like he was afraid of breaking something precious. Margaret kissed him back, tasting coffee and smoke and the promise of a future they'd fight for together. When they pulled apart, Crow said, I should probably move back into the house, now that we're actually married. Probably, Margaret agreed, though that bed's pretty narrow. We'll build a bigger one. Add it to the list. They sat together by the fire, planning and dreaming until exhaustion finally won. When they stumbled to bed, Crow's bed, their bed now, they fell asleep tangled together, fully clothed, too tired for anything but the simple comfort of not being alone. The next week passed in a blur of activity. They filed the legitimate land claim, this time with Margaret's real signature and proper documentation. They met with a surveyor to establish exact boundaries. They began pricing materials, making lists, sketching rough plans for the house they'd build. Word spread about Langford's arrest, about Hayward's fraud scheme. People who'd been skeptical of Margaret and Crow's marriage suddenly found reasons to stop by the forge, to offer congratulations or business or simple respect. The territory appreciated anyone who beat a con artist at their own game. Ruth threw them a proper wedding celebration a week after the hearing, barn dance at the Palmers' property north of Caldera. Half the town showed up, along with ranchers and settlers from miles around. There was fiddle music and dancing and more food than Margaret had seen in months. Crow was awkward at the dancing, trying to figure out the steps with one arm, but Margaret didn't care. They moved together like they worked together, not graceful, but functional, effective. Daniel Palmer pulled Margaret aside at one point, beer in hand, and said, You're good for him, you know. Haven't seen Ethan smile this much since he came to the territory. He's good for me too, Margaret said, watching Crow talk with a group of ranchers. He sees me as capable. You are capable. Hell, you went up against Langford and Hayward and won. That's more than most men around here could say. Daniel raised his beer. To capability. And to surviving Montana territory. To surviving, Margaret echoed and drank. 2 months later, they broke ground on the new house. Not at the exact site of the Brennan home, too many ghosts there, but 100 yards north, on a slight rise that gave views of the creek and the mountains beyond. Crow did most of the heavy construction with help from neighbors who came to raise the frame. Margaret managed the logistics, ordering materials, coordinating workers, keeping accounts. They worked through the summer heat, through afternoon thunderstorms that turned the site to mud, through long days that left them exhausted and satisfied in equal measure. By September, the house had walls and a roof. By October, windows and a door. By the time the first snow fell in November, they had a functioning stove, a proper bed, and 4 walls that kept out the cold. It wasn't finished. Half the interior still needed work, the floors were rough, and the chimney smoked when the wind came from the wrong direction. But it was theirs. Built with their own hands and stubborn determination. They moved in 2 days before Thanksgiving. That night, lying in their new bed in their new house on their land, Margaret felt something she'd spent years not believing in, peace. What are you thinking? Crow asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. That I can't believe this is real. That 6 months ago I was in Philadelphia with nothing, and now I'm here with everything. Everything's a strong word. House still needs work. You know what I mean. She turned to face him. I spent 26 years in a marriage where I made myself smaller to fit, where I managed and fixed and endured and never quite felt like I had a right to want more. And now I have a partner who wants me exactly as large and difficult and capable as I am, who builds with me instead of expecting me to just maintain what he creates. She touched his scarred face gently. Thank you for that, for seeing me. Thank you for staying, Crow said. even when it got hard, even when leaving would have been easier. Leaving's never easier, just lonelier. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, the house creaking and settling around them like it was learning to be a home. Winter came hard that year. The snows started in December and didn't let up until March. Margaret and Crow spent long weeks essentially trapped in the house and forge, going out only to care for the animals or retrieve supplies from the root cellar they'd dug. But the isolation didn't feel oppressive. They worked together, Crow on metalwork at the forge, Margaret on accounts and planning for spring. They taught each other their skills. Crow showed her more advanced metalworking, and she taught him better record-keeping and business strategy. They read by lamplight, talked through long evenings, discovered the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. In January, a package arrived via the mail courier, a thick envelope with no return address. Inside, a letter in the familiar handwriting of James Dalton. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. Crow read over her shoulder. Margaret, by now you know there is no James Dalton. I apologize for the deception, but desperate measures seem necessary for desperate circumstances. I won't reveal my identity, that's not relevant, but I will tell you why. I knew your late husband many years ago. Thomas was a good man who made poor choices and left you to suffer the consequences. When I learned of Langford's scheme to pursue you for fabricated debts, I couldn't stand by. But I also knew you wouldn't accept charity. So I created a situation where you'd have to fight for something that seemed worth fighting for, where your capability and strength would have space to prove itself. The land was always meant to be yours. I filed the fraudulent claim knowing you'd investigate, knowing you'd uncover the scheme, knowing you were smart enough to find a way through. I didn't anticipate Ethan Crow, but I'm glad he was there. You deserved someone who'd see your worth. This is my last communication. The land is legally yours now. What you build on it is entirely up to you. I wish you every happiness. J.D. Margaret read it twice, then handed it to Crow. What do you think? I think someone felt guilty about Thomas and tried to make amends in the most complicated way possible. He folded the letter. Does it matter who it was? No, Margaret said slowly. I don't think it does. Whoever J.D. is, they gave me a chance. What I did with it, that was me. We did that ourselves. Damn right we did. Crow tossed the letter into the fire. Let's keep it that way. They watched the paper curl and blacken, taking the last mystery with it. Some questions didn't need answering. Some gifts didn't need explaining. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, the creek ran high with runoff, and the land turned green with new growth. Margaret and Crow planted their first crops: wheat, oats, a kitchen garden near the house. They bought 3 cows, a dozen chickens, a pig that Margaret named Determination, despite Crow's protests that you shouldn't name food. Ruth visited often, bringing gossip and goods from town. Langford had been convicted of fraud and conspiracy, sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison. Hayward had fled before charges could be filed, reportedly seen heading toward California. His hotel and properties had been seized and auctioned, the proceeds going to his victims. Justice, Ruth said, sipping coffee on their porch. Slow, but it got there. Better late than never, Margaret agreed. Life settled into seasons and rhythms. The forge business grew steadily as Margaret's management improved efficiency and Crow's reputation spread. The homestead produced enough to sustain them and sell surplus in Caldera. They weren't rich, would probably never be rich, but they were stable, secure, building something lasting. On Margaret's 49th birthday, Crow presented her with a set of metal-worked hinges for the cabinet she'd been building. Practical gift, but the craftsmanship was extraordinary, each hinge decorated with tiny forged flowers. They're beautiful, Margaret said, running her fingers over the delicate metalwork. You mentioned once that your mother had cabinets with flowers on the hinges, from her grandmother in England. I thought, he shrugged, thought you might like something similar. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. You remembered that? I remember most things you tell me. She kissed him then, deeply and thoroughly, the hinges forgotten on the table. When they pulled apart, she said, I love you, you know. Probably should have said it before now. I know, Crow said. You show it every day. But hearing it's nice too. He smiled. I love you back. In case that wasn't obvious. Fairly obvious. but nice to hear anyway. That summer, they finished the interior of the house. Real floors, plastered walls, a kitchen that Margaret designed herself with enough counter space to actually work. It would never be fancy. They were homesteaders, not society people. But it was solid, functional, and entirely theirs. In August, Mary Brennan came to visit. Margaret had written to her months ago, care of the address Ruth had provided. Just a short letter explaining what had happened to the property, how it was being cared for, offering condolences for her losses. She hadn't expected a response. Certainly hadn't expected the woman herself to appear one afternoon, stepping down from the stagecoach in Caldera with two nearly grown children beside her. I had to see it, Mary said when Margaret met them in town. Had to know someone was making something good from all that loss. They rode out to the homestead together. Margaret showed her the new house, the rebuilt barn, the fields of growing crops, pointed out where the old buildings had stood, where her husband and son were buried under simple stone markers Crow had made. Mary stood quietly at the graves for a long time. Then she turned to Margaret. Thank you for taking care of this place, for making it live again. It's us who should thank you, Margaret said. You and your family built the foundation. We're just continuing the work. You're doing more than that. You're proving that sometimes endings aren't final, that burned things can be rebuilt into something new. Mary smiled, tired but genuine. I'm glad it's you doing it. Glad it's someone who understands what it costs. They talked for hours, Mary sharing stories of the homestead's early days, Margaret describing their plans for expansion. The children ran through the fields, and for a little while, ghosts and present overlapped peacefully. When Mary left the next day, she hugged Margaret tightly. You're stronger than you think, strong enough to build a life anywhere. But I'm glad you built it here. So am I, Margaret said. Fall came, bringing harvest and preparation for winter. Margaret and Crow worked side by side, storing food, securing buildings, making ready for the cold months ahead. They'd learned from last winter were better prepared this time. On a clear October evening, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. The forge smoked in the distance. The fields lay ready for winter rest, and everything they'd built together stood solid around them. You know what day it is? Crow asked. Margaret thought. October 15th. Why? Exactly 1 year since you stepped off that stagecoach in Caldera. He looked at her. 1 year since you refused to give up and go back home. This is home now. That was just the place I left. Fair point. Crow took her hand, rough fingers intertwining with hers. You glad you stayed, knowing everything it cost? Margaret thought about that year, the fear and uncertainty, the legal battles, the backbreaking work of building a life from nothing. She thought about cold nights and hard days, about learning to survive in country that didn't forgive mistakes. But she also thought about partnership and respect, about building something real with her own hands, about being valued for her strength instead of despite it. She thought about this man beside her who'd taken a chance on a desperate stranger and somehow ended up loving her. I'm glad, she said. Wouldn't change any of it. Not even the parts where you thought we'd lose everything? Especially not those parts. They proved we could survive anything if we stood together. Crow smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that still made her heart catch. To surviving, then, and to whatever comes next. To whatever comes next, Margaret echoed. They sat on that porch as darkness fell and stars emerged, countless and brilliant in the Montana sky. Somewhere out there, the territory continued its indifferent rotation. People arriving with dreams, people leaving broken, people like them finding ways to build something lasting against impossible odds. Margaret Crow, formerly Hale, formerly lost, had traveled 2,000 miles chasing letters from a man who didn't exist. But in the searching, she'd found something real. A partner, a home, a life worth fighting for. At 48, when the world had written her off as too old, too broke, too worn down to start over, she'd proved them wrong in the most fundamental way possible. She'd simply refused to fade. And in refusing, she had discovered that beginning again wasn't about age or circumstance or what others believed possible. It was about looking at the ashes of what was, seeing the potential of what could be, and having the courage to build it yourself. Winter would come again. Storms would test their foundations. The territory would throw new challenges at them because that's what the territory did. But they'd face it together, these two imperfect people who'd found each other through deception and built something true from it. They'd survive. They'd endure. And maybe, if they were lucky and stubborn and willing to work for it, they'd do more than survive. They'd thrive. The forge fire burned steady in the distance, smoke rising into the clear night air. Inside the house, lamps waited to be lit, dinner waited to be made, all the small rituals of home waited to be honored. Margaret squeezed Crow's hand once, then stood. "Come on, let's go inside. Tomorrow we start planning the spring planting, but tonight we eat warm food and be grateful for what we've got." "What have we got?" Crow asked, though his smile said he knew the answer. "Everything that matters," Margaret said. "Everything that's real." They walked inside together, closing the door against the Montana night, and the house welcomed them home with warmth and lamplight and the solid promise of walls they'd built themselves. It wasn't the life Margaret had planned. It wasn't the future anyone would have predicted for her. It was better, and it was hers.